Carl Jung explained, "The ego will cling, but the soul will wait." The morning light that streams through your window carries with it the same deception that has accompanied humanity since the first dawn. The illusion that what we see is all there is, that the face reflected in the mirror is the totality of our being. You wake as you have awakened countless times before, into a world where the persona reigns supreme, where the carefully constructed self moves through its familiar choreography of being, never questioning whether the dancer and the dance are one. But listen closely, for beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary existence lies a truth that the ego fears more than death itself. You are not who you think you are. The identity you carry, polished to perfection through years of careful cultivation, is nothing more than a gilded cage, its golden bars so beautiful that you have mistaken imprisonment for palace walls. In the depths of the psyche, where the authentic self dwells in patient silence, there exists a knowing that transcends the ego's elaborate constructions. This deeper intelligence watches as you perform the daily ritual of becoming yourself, applying the masks, rehearsing the lines, stepping into the role that society has scripted for you with such precision that you have forgotten it is merely a performance. The persona, that masterpiece of psychological architecture, stands before you like a magnificent cathedral, its spires reaching toward heaven, while its foundations rest upon the shifting sands of collective expectation. Every stone in its construction has been quarried from the bedrock of conformity, each architectural detail carefully designed to please the eyes of others. You have spent decades as both architect and worshiper in this temple of self-presentation, genuflecting before the altar of external validation, never questioning whether the God you serve is real or merely a projection of your deepest insecurities. Jung understood that the persona serves a necessary function in the theater of human interaction. It is the mask we wear to navigate the complex social landscape, the diplomatic face we present to a world that demands certain performances. Yet somewhere in the corridors of your unconscious, a voice whispers of the tragedy inherent in this arrangement. When the actor forgets they are acting, when the mask fuses so completely with the face that removal becomes impossible without the terror of discovering there may be nothing underneath. This is the gilded prison of self-deception, where comfort becomes the warden and familiarity the strongest lock. The ego, that tireless guardian of the status quo, patrols the perimeter of consciousness with vigilant dedication, ensuring that nothing threatening penetrates the carefully maintained boundaries of known reality. It speaks to you in the language of reason and practicality, convincing you that the narrow corridors of your current existence represent the full breadth of possibility, that the small circle of light cast by your conscious awareness illuminates all that matters in the vast darkness of being. Yet even as you move through the familiar rhythms of your days, something stirs in the depths, a restlessness that no amount of external achievement can satisfy, a hunger that cannot be fed by the usual sustenance of ego gratification. The authentic self, patient as stone but insistent as water, begins to make its presence known through the cracks in your carefully constructed facade. Dreams carry messages in symbols too ancient for the rational mind to decode. Moments of inexplicable melancholy wash over you like tides from an unknown ocean. The activities that once brought satisfaction now feel hollow, their colors faded like photographs left too long in sunlight. This is the beginning of what Jung called the confrontation with the unconscious, not a violent collision but a gentle awakening to the reality that consciousness is merely the tip of an iceberg whose vast bulk remains hidden beneath the surface of awareness. The ego experiences this awakening as a threat, for it has built its entire empire upon the assumption that what lies outside its dominion is either irrelevant or dangerous. Like a medieval king faced with reports of lands beyond the edges of his carefully drawn maps, the ego dismisses these stirrings as fantasy or pathology, symptoms to be managed rather than invitations to explore. But the psyche is not a monarchy where one aspect rules supreme. It is an ecosystem where various forces seek balance and expression. The persona, for all its magnificent construction, represents only one voice in the parliament of the soul. Behind its polished presentations, other aspects of being wait in the wings. The shadow with its rejected energies, the animus or anima, with its mysterious knowledge of the contrasexual, the self with its promise of integration and wholeness. In the early stages of psychological development, the ego's alliance with the persona feels like strength itself. You learn to navigate social situations with increasing skill, to present versions of yourself that garner approval and success. The feedback loop of external validation becomes addictive. Each compliment another bar in the golden cage, each achievement another reason to believe that this constructed self represents the pinnacle of what you can become. The mirror reflects back not truth but expectation, and you learn to love the reflection more than the reality it supposedly represents. This seductive dance with self-deception unfolds across decades with such subtlety that its participants rarely recognize the steps. Childhood's authentic expressiveness gradually gives way to adolescent conformity, which matures into adult sophistication. At each stage, the persona grows more elaborate, more convincing, more capable of generating the responses it craves from the external world. Success follows success, and with each victory, the prison walls grow higher, more beautiful, more unbreachable. The tragedy is not that we develop personas, they are as necessary as clothing in a harsh climate, but that we confuse the clothing for the body, the mask for the face, the role for the actor. Somewhere in the process of becoming socially acceptable, we lose touch with the wild intelligence that dwells at the core of being, that untamed aspect of self that knows truth not through consensus, but through direct encounter with reality. In the depths of the unconscious, this authentic self maintains its vigil, watching as the ego constructs its elaborate defenses against the unknown. It observes without judgment as you perform the daily sacraments of self-maintenance, checking your reflection, adjusting your presentation, rehearsing your responses to anticipated challenges. It witnesses the exhaustion that comes from constant performance, the way each social interaction becomes a test to be passed rather than a connection to be enjoyed. And it waits with the patience that only immortal things possess for the moment when the actor grows weary of the stage. That weariness, when it comes, feels like depression or crisis, like failure or breakdown. The ego interprets any crack in its perfect facade as catastrophe, rallying all its resources to repair the damage and restore the illusion of seamless control. It recruits allies from the external world, therapists who promise to adjust rather than transform, friends who offer comfort rather than challenge, activities that distract rather than illuminate. The entire apparatus of modern life seems designed to help us avoid the one encounter that might actually heal us, the meeting between our constructed self and our authentic being. But the psyche is not so easily deceived by its own creations. The unconscious operates according to laws older than civilization, patterns that preceded the ego's rise to dominance and will outlast its eventual dissolution. Like a river finding its way to the sea, despite all human attempts at redirection, the authentic self continues its slow work of erosion, wearing away at the foundations of false identity with the persistence of water against stone. This erosion manifests in countless ways: the dream that haunts your sleep with images you cannot decode, the moment of unexpected emotion that overwhelms your careful composure, the growing sense that your achievements, however impressive to others, somehow miss the point of what it means to be alive. These are not symptoms of psychological illness, but invitations to a deeper conversation with reality, glimpses of a larger existence that the ego's narrow focus has kept hidden from view. The gilded prison of self-deception maintains its hold through a complex system of rewards and punishments, all administered by the ego's relentless pursuit of external validation. Each compliment becomes evidence that the persona is working, each criticism a threat to be defended against with increasing sophistication. The ego learns to read the environment with the skill of a meteorologist, adjusting its presentations to match the prevailing winds of social expectation. Yet no amount of skill can eliminate the fundamental anxiety that underlies this entire enterprise. The fear that beneath the carefully constructed surface there may be nothing worth discovering, or worse still, something too alien to integrate into the familiar world of conscious identity. This fear keeps us trapped not through force, but through seduction, like a beautiful prison whose bars are made of our own need for approval and control. We become connoisseurs of our own limitation, experts in the art of staying safely within the bounds of what we already know. The persona grows ever more elaborate, more convincing, more capable of generating the responses it craves. Yet, with each refinement, the gap between authentic being and performed identity widens like a fault line in the Earth's crust. Jung recognized that this splitting between conscious presentation and unconscious reality creates a tension that must eventually find resolution. The psyche abhors fragmentation, the way nature abhors a vacuum, and the energy required to maintain the separation between persona and authentic self creates a pressure that seeks release through whatever cracks it can find. Dreams become more vivid, emotions more volatile, the sense of living someone else's life more acute. These are not signs of breakdown, but of breakthrough. The unconscious mind's attempt to restore balance to a system that has grown dangerously one-sided. Yet the ego, committed to its role as guardian of the known, interprets these stirrings as threats to be managed rather than messages to be received. It enlists the aid of every available resource: medication to quiet the emotional storms, activity to distract from the growing sense of emptiness, achievement to prove that the current path is the right one. Like a medieval physician treating symptoms while ignoring the underlying disease, the ego focuses on suppressing the manifestations of psychological imbalance rather than addressing their source. But the authentic self is not so easily silenced. It speaks in the language of symbol and metaphor, of sudden insight and inexplicable longing, of moments when the familiar world becomes transparent and something vast and mysterious shows through. These glimpses of deeper reality come not as rewards for good behavior, but as birthright, as natural as breath to those who have not forgotten how to breathe with the whole body rather than just the lungs of consciousness. The challenge is that recognizing these glimpses requires a willingness to question the very foundation upon which the ego has built its empire. It demands that we consider the possibility that our carefully constructed identity, however successful it may appear to the external world, represents only a fraction of what we might become. This consideration feels like standing at the edge of an abyss, for the ego cannot imagine existence beyond the boundaries of its current understanding. And so we find ourselves in the position of prisoners who have grown to love their chains, who polish them until they gleam like gold and mistake their weight for strength. The key to our freedom hangs always within reach, yet we dare not grasp it for fear of discovering that the world beyond our cell is too vast, too uncertain, too alive to navigate with the familiar maps that have guided us this far. This, then, is the gilded prison of self-deception, not a place of obvious suffering, but of subtle limitation, not a dungeon of despair, but a palace of restriction. Its walls are built from our own need for certainty and control, its bars forged from our fear of the unknown aspects of our being. It offers the illusion of safety in exchange for the reality of growth, the comfort of the known in place of the adventure of becoming. Yet even now, as you recognize the outlines of this beautiful cage, something in you responds to the possibility of freedom. The authentic self, patient as stone but fluid as water, feels the first stirrings of movement after its long wait. The persona, sensing change in the wind, tightens its grip on familiar patterns while the ego marshals its defenses against the approaching unknown. The stage is set for the great drama of individuation, that lifelong process of becoming who you truly are rather than who you think you should be. The gilded prison stands ready to be transcended, its golden bars revealed as nothing more than light and shadow, its apparent solidity exposed as the malleable creation of consciousness itself. But first, the masks must crack. The first crack appears on a Tuesday morning in April, so small and seemingly insignificant that you almost miss it entirely. You are standing before the bathroom mirror, engaged in the familiar ritual of preparing your face for the world, when something in your reflection catches your eye, not a blemish or a wrinkle, but something deeper, more unsettling. For just a moment, the person looking back at you seems like a stranger, their eyes carrying a weight that your conscious mind has never acknowledged, their expression bearing traces of a sorrow you cannot name. The moment passes quickly, dismissed by the rational mind as a trick of the morning light or the residue of an unremembered dream. Yet something has shifted in the invisible architecture of identity, a hairline fracture in the seamless surface of the persona that will, in time, grow into a chasm wide enough to swallow entire worlds of assumed truth. This is how transformation begins, not with dramatic revelation or sudden collapse, but with the almost imperceptible loosening of what Jung called the provisional life, that carefully constructed existence we inhabit while waiting for real life to begin. The masks we wear with such expertise begin to show their age, their weight becoming apparent for the first time since we learned to lift them with unconscious grace. You have spent decades perfecting the art of self-presentation, learning to modulate your voice, adjust your posture, calibrate your responses to extract maximum approval from whatever audience stands before you. The process has become so automatic that you have forgotten it is a process at all, mistaking the performance for reality itself. Yet now, in moments of unexpected stillness, you catch glimpses of the tremendous effort required to maintain this elaborate construction, the way a practiced dancer might suddenly become aware of the muscles that have been holding them upright all these years. The persona, that masterpiece of social engineering, was never meant to be a permanent dwelling but a temporary shelter while deeper structures took root. Like scaffolding around a building under construction, it served its purpose in the early stages of psychological development, providing support and shape while the authentic self slowly organized itself in the depths of the unconscious. But scaffolding left too long in place becomes an impediment to the very building it was meant to protect, and what began as support transforms gradually into constraint. Jung understood that every persona carries within it the seeds of its own transcendence, for no construction, however skillful, can indefinitely contain the wild intelligence that seeks expression through human consciousness. The cracks that begin to appear in midlife are not signs of failure but of success, evidence that something real and vital has been growing beneath the surface of social acceptability, gathering strength for the moment when it will demand recognition. These initial fissures manifest in countless ways, each as unique as the individual consciousness that experiences them. You might find yourself inexplicably moved by music that once seemed merely pleasant, tears flowing for reasons that the logical mind cannot decode. Or perhaps it is irritation that surfaces, a growing impatience with conversations that once felt meaningful, activities that once provided satisfaction now revealed as hollow pantomime. The familiar rhythms of your days begin to feel like chains, their predictable comfort transformed into suffocating routine. At first, the ego responds to these disturbances with its characteristic efficiency, mobilizing all available resources to restore the previous equilibrium. It offers reasonable explanations for the growing discontent, stress at work, seasonal depression, the natural consequence of aging. It prescribes familiar remedies, a vacation to restore perspective, a new hobby to inject novelty, perhaps a consultation with professionals who specialize in returning wayward consciousness to its proper functioning. Yet the cracks continue to spread, following invisible fault lines in the structure of identity that were established long before conscious memory began its recording. The persona, so magnificent in its prime, begins to show the strain of supporting a weight it was never designed to bear indefinitely. Like a theatrical costume worn too many times, it starts to fray at the edges, its colors fading, its fit becoming uncomfortable in ways that cannot be adjusted through mere alteration. The unconscious, meanwhile, stirs with increasing vigor, sending up signals that register first as dreams too vivid to dismiss, then as synchronicities too meaningful to ignore. The rational mind, trained to filter out anything that cannot be measured or predicted, finds itself overwhelmed by data that resists classification. Images from childhood resurface with unexpected emotional charge. Chance encounters carry weight far beyond their apparent significance. The boundary between inner and outer reality becomes permeable in ways that would have seemed pathological just months before. This permeability terrifies the ego, whose entire existence depends upon maintaining clear distinctions between self and other, known and unknown, safe and dangerous. It has spent years constructing elaborate defense systems against the chaos it perceives lurking beyond the edges of consciousness, and now those very defenses seem to be failing. Like a fortress whose walls are crumbling under assault from an enemy that cannot be seen or understood, the ego doubles down on familiar strategies, even as their effectiveness diminishes. But the force that presses against the boundaries of conscious identity is not an enemy at all. It is the return of the repressed, the emergence of aspects of being that were sacrificed in the process of becoming socially acceptable. Jung called this the confrontation with the shadow, though in the early stages of the process, what emerges is less the dark negative of the persona than its bright opposite, all the qualities and potentials that were deemed too risky, too impractical, too authentic for public consumption. The shadow, contrary to popular understanding, is not simply the repository of evil impulses, but the storehouse of unlived life, the treasury of potentials that were rejected in favor of the narrower identity that gained social approval. Within its depths lie not only the anger and sexuality that civilized consciousness fears, but also the creativity and spontaneity, the tenderness and wildness that were deemed inappropriate for the roles we learned to play. As the persona's grip begins to loosen, these rejected aspects of being start to reclaim their rightful place in the economy of the psyche. The process feels like revolution to the ego, which has grown accustomed to ruling through the suppression of anything that might threaten its carefully maintained order. Yet, from the perspective of the authentic self, it is nothing more radical than breathing, the natural expansion and contraction of consciousness that allows for growth and renewal. The initial, Stages of this process often manifest as what the psychological literature terms midlife crisis, though the phrase trivializes what is actually one of the most profound transitions available to human consciousness. It is the moment when the provisional life reveals itself as provisional, when the temporary shelter of persona begins to feel less like protection and more like imprisonment. The very achievements that once seemed to validate the chosen path now feel hollow, their external shine unable to illuminate the growing darkness within. This darkness is not depression, though it may wear depression's mask. It is the fertile void from which new life emerges, the necessary emptiness that precedes genuine fullness. Jung recognized it as the negrado of psychological transformation, the first stage of an alchemical process that would ultimately transmute the base metal of ego consciousness into the gold of individuation. But in the early phases, all that can be perceived is the dissolution of what once seemed solid, the collapse of structures that had provided meaning and direction for decades. The ego experiences this dissolution as death itself, mobilizing every available resource to prevent what it perceives as annihilation. It recruits allies from every corner of conscious and unconscious life, family members who reinforce familiar patterns, professional obligations that demand continued performance, even symptoms and illnesses that justify retreat from the challenging territory that beckons beyond the boundaries of known identity. Yet the cracks continue to spread, following laws deeper than the ego's will to survive unchanged. What began as hairline fractures in the surface of the persona gradually reveal themselves as fundamental structural flaws in the entire edifice of constructed identity. The masks that once felt like natural extensions of the face begin to chafe like ill-fitting garments. The roles that once provided clear direction now feel like scripts written for someone else, their dialogue foreign in your mouth, despite years of faithful recitation. In quiet moments when the demands of daily performance temporarily abate, you catch glimpses of what lies beneath the cracking facade, not the void that the ego fears, but a presence both strange and familiar, alien yet more authentically yourself than the carefully curated identity you have shown the world. This presence speaks in a voice you remember from childhood dreams, carries itself with a grace that no amount of social conditioning could manufacture, looks out through your eyes with an intelligence that precedes all learning. The recognition of this deeper self is simultaneously the most natural and most shocking experience available to human consciousness. Natural, because it represents a homecoming to what you have always been, beneath the layers of adaptation and performance. Shocking, because it reveals the magnitude of the self-deception that has masqueraded as normal life for so many years. This shock reverberates through every aspect of existence, calling into question not only who you are, but who you have been, not only what you want, but what you have been taught to want, not only where you are going, but whether the destination was ever truly yours to choose. The carefully constructed narratives that have provided meaning and direction begin to unravel like tapestries whose threads have been pulled by invisible hands. Relationships that once felt solid reveal their foundation in mutual persona maintenance rather than genuine connection. Career paths that once seemed inevitable expose themselves as elaborate compromises between authentic calling and external expectation. Even the most basic assumptions about reality, what matters, what is possible, what constitutes a life well lived, become subjects for re-examination rather than articles of unquestioned faith. The ego watches this unraveling with mounting panic, like a general whose army is deserting not to join the enemy, but to return home to lives they had temporarily abandoned for the sake of war. It cannot comprehend a victory that looks like dissolution, a success that requires the abandonment of everything it has worked to achieve. In its desperation, it may resort to increasingly extreme measures to maintain control. Addictive behaviors that numb the growing awareness, compulsive activities that provide distraction from the inner voice that grows stronger with each passing day, even dramatic life changes that give the illusion of transformation while leaving the fundamental structure of identity intact. But the psyche is not so easily deceived by its own defenses. The authentic self, having tasted freedom in the cracks of the crumbling persona, will not be satisfied with cosmetic adjustments or temporary distractions. Like water finding its level, it seeks the configuration that allows for maximum flow, maximum expression of its essential nature. The pressure it exerts is not violent but inexorable, the steady force of truth asserting itself against the accumulated weight of years of self-deception. This pressure manifests differently in each individual consciousness, following the unique fault lines that exist within every constructed identity. For some, it emerges as creative urgency, the sudden need to write, paint, compose, or otherwise give form to visions that seem to arise from depths previously unknown. For others, it appears as relational restlessness, the growing inability to maintain connections based on mutual performance rather than authentic recognition. Still others experience it as spiritual awakening, the unexpected opening to dimensions of reality that the rational mind had dismissed as fantasy or superstition. Whatever form it takes, the emergence of the authentic self creates what Jung called Anantiodroia, the tendency of things to turn into their opposites when carried to extremes. The persona that once provided security becomes a source of constraint. The achievements that once generated pride now feel like betrayals of deeper calling. The very foundations of identity that once seemed unshakable reveal themselves as temporary constructions that have outlived their usefulness. This reversal is not pathology but health, not breakdown but breakthrough. It represents the psyche's natural impulse toward balance and wholeness, the correction of a course that has veered too far from its true heading. Yet to the ego, caught in the midst of transformation, it cannot control or understand. It feels like the end of the world. And in a sense, it is exactly that, the end of a world built on the assumption that consciousness is limited to its own surface manifestations, that identity is fixed rather than fluid, that growth ends with the achievement of social competence. The cracks in the persona are cracks in consensus reality itself, fissures through which a larger universe begins to show itself. As these cracks widen and multiply, as the familiar world of constructed meaning begins its slow-motion collapse, the stage is set for what Jung recognized as the most crucial encounter in the life of every individual consciousness, the meeting with the shadow, that rejected aspect of being that holds both the darkness we fear and the light we have forgotten we possess. The masks are beginning to crack, and something vast and patient stirs in the depths, preparing to claim its place in the economy of a more complete existence. The golden bars of the beautiful prison grow visible at last, and with that recognition comes both terror and exhilaration, the fear of the unknown, and the wild hope that perhaps, at last, real life might actually be ready to begin. In the depths of every human psyche lies a figure both terrifying and essential, cast into exile by the very process that creates civilized consciousness. This is the shadow, not merely the darkness we refuse to acknowledge, but the repository of all the life force we have sacrificed on the altar of social acceptability. It dwells in the basement of being, patient as sediment, gathering power with each act of denial, each moment of self-betrayal, each choice to be who we think we should be rather than who we are. The shadow extends its invitation not through words, but through dreams that disturb your sleep, through the inexplicable attraction to precisely those qualities you most vehemently condemn in others, through the sudden eruptions of emotion that seem to come from nowhere, yet feel more authentically yours than any carefully modulated response you have ever offered the world. It speaks in the language of what Jung called the return of the repressed, that psychological law which ensures that whatever we refuse to consciously integrate will eventually demand recognition through increasingly dramatic means. You have spent your life constructing an identity based on careful selection, choosing which aspects of your nature to cultivate and which to banish to the outer darkness beyond the circle of acceptable selfhood. The process began so early that you cannot remember its inception, guided by parents who themselves had learned to fragment their being in service of social harmony, teachers who rewarded compliance over authenticity, peers whose approval required the sacrifice of whatever made you different, dangerous, or difficult to categorize. With each year of this careful curation, the shadow grew stronger, fed by the very energy you denied it. Every moment of anger swallowed for the sake of appearing reasonable, every creative impulse suppressed for the sake of being practical, every wild joy muted for the sake of maintaining dignity. All of this rejected life force accumulated in the depths of the unconscious, like water behind a dam, waiting for the moment when the pressure would become too great for the constructed barriers to contain. But the shadow is not, as popular psychology often suggests, simply a collection of negative traits waiting to corrupt the pure intentions of consciousness. It is far more complex and paradoxical, the storehouse of not only what we consider dark about ourselves, but also what is most vital, most creative, most authentically alive. Within its boundaries dwell the rage that could fuel justice, the selfishness that could enable self-care, the chaos that could birth new order, the darkness that could illuminate previously invisible realms of possibility. Jung understood that the shadow contains not just our personal rejected material, but also collective energies that have been deemed incompatible with civilized existence. It holds the wildness that remembers what it felt like to be an animal, the primal intelligence that operated long before rational thought learned to organize experience into manageable categories. In its depths swim the instincts that guided humanity through millennia of survival, the emotional truths that preceded and will outlast all cultural conditioning, the archetypal energies that connect individual consciousness to the vast patterns that govern all life. The shadow's invitation comes at the moment when the persona's cracks have grown wide enough to allow previously banished material to seep through into conscious awareness. Suddenly, you find yourself fascinated by precisely those types of people your social circle would consider inappropriate. The artist whose creative disorder offends your carefully maintained sense of respectability, the rebel whose refusal to conform awakens something you thought you had successfully buried, the outcast whose very existence reminds you of paths not taken and possibilities not explored. These fascinations feel dangerous because they are dangerous, not to your physical survival, but to the psychological structure you have mistaken for your true self. The shadow calls you toward integration of what has been split off, toward a wholeness that can only be achieved by reclaiming the rejected aspects of your being. Yet this reclamation threatens the very foundation upon which your current identity rests, the careful balance of conscious and unconscious that has allowed you to function within the narrow parameters of socially acceptable existence. The ego responds to the shadow's invitation with predictable alarm, marshaling all its defenses against what it perceives as an invasion from hostile territory. It projects the threatening material onto others, making them carriers of the rejected aspects, so that these qualities can be safely despised from a distance rather than owned as part of the self. The very person who triggers your strongest negative reaction often carries some aspect of your shadow, embodying with disturbing clarity what you have worked so hard to eliminate from your own self-image. This process of projection serves a temporary protective function, allowing consciousness to maintain its illusion of purity while keeping the shadow material at arm's length. Yet it also creates a fundamental split in the psyche, dividing the world into acceptable and unacceptable, light and dark, us and them, divisions that must eventually be healed if genuine wholeness is to be achieved. The shadow's true invitation is not to become what you have rejected, but to integrate what you have denied, to expand consciousness to include rather than exclude, to develop what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold paradox without demanding resolution, to embrace complexity without retreating into simplification. This integration cannot be achieved through rational analysis alone, but requires a descent into the depths of the psyche, a willingness to encounter what has been buried beneath layers of conditioning and self-control. The descent begins with recognition, the shocking moment when you glimpse your own face in the mirror of projection and realize that what you have been condemning in others' lives also within yourself. This recognition arrives not as intellectual understanding but as visceral knowing, a body-level acknowledgement that the enemy you have been fighting is actually an exiled aspect of your own being, seeking not to destroy you but to return home to the wholeness from which it was banished. The initial response to this recognition is often horror, for it challenges the fundamental assumption upon which civilized consciousness operates, the belief that we can become good by eliminating evil, pure by rejecting impurity, light by denying darkness. The shadow's invitation reveals this assumption as not only false but actively harmful, a splitting that diminishes rather than enhances human potential. Yet beyond the initial horror lies something unexpected: relief. For the first time in your adult life, you are invited to stop the exhausting work of maintaining artificial purity, to lay down the burden of being always reasonable, always appropriate, always less than fully human. The shadow offers not corruption but completion, not degradation but integration of the full spectrum of what it means to be alive. This integration cannot be rushed or forced but must unfold according to its own organic timing, like a flower that opens only when conditions are right for blooming. The ego's tendency is to approach shadow work as another project to be managed, another problem to be solved through the application of will and technique. But the shadow responds not to control but to curiosity, not to conquest but to conversation, not to elimination but to acknowledgement and inclusion. The process often begins in dreams, where the usual censors of consciousness relax their vigilance and allow rejected material to present itself in symbolic form. You might dream of dark figures pursuing you through endless corridors, only to discover upon waking that what seemed like pursuit was actually invitation, what felt like threat was actually offering. Or perhaps the shadow appears as the wild child you once were before socialization taught you to color within the lines, the untamed aspect of self that knew joy without justification and anger without guilt. These nocturnal encounters serve as preparation for the more challenging work of conscious integration, the deliberate engagement with aspects of self that have been relegated to the unconscious. This engagement requires what Jung called active imagination, a state of receptive attention that allows unconscious contents to present themselves for examination and dialogue rather than immediate judgment or suppression. In active imagination, you might find yourself in conversation with the critic whose harsh voice has driven you toward perfectionism, discovering beneath its apparent cruelty a wounded aspect that learned early in life that nothing less than flawlessness would guarantee love. Or you might encounter the rebel who has been suppressed in service of social harmony, learning that its revolutionary energy contains not destructiveness, but the vital force needed to break free from situations that no longer serve growth. These encounters reveal that what you have called shadow is often simply life force that has been channeled in unconscious rather than conscious directions. The aggression you have denied may actually be power that has been misdirected. The selfishness you have rejected may be self-care that has been distorted by shame. The chaos you have feared may be creativity that has been constrained by excessive need for control. As the dialogue with the shadow deepens, you begin to discover that its apparently negative qualities often serve essential functions that have been overlooked or undervalued by conscious awareness. The anger that seems so inappropriate may actually be the guardian of important boundaries that have been violated. The jealousy that feels so shameful may be pointing toward unlived aspects of your own potential. The laziness that appears so self-indulgent may be wisdom that knows when rest is more important than productivity. This revaluation of rejected qualities does not mean acting them out unconsciously or using integration as an excuse for destructive behavior. Rather, it means bringing them into conscious relationship where their energy can be channeled in service of wholeness rather than fragmentation. The integrated shadow becomes not a threat to civilized existence, but its most essential foundation. The dark soil in which genuine virtue can take root, the shadow that gives depth and reality to the light. Jung understood that shadow integration is not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing process that continues throughout the lifetime. For consciousness is constantly evolving, and each new level of development brings with it new material that must be integrated. What was successfully integrated at one stage of life may need to be revisited and reintegrated at another as changing circumstances reveal previously hidden aspects of the shadow's complexity. The fear that keeps most people from embarking on this integration is the ego's conviction that acknowledging darkness will lead inevitably to being overcome by it. Yet the opposite is true. It is the rejected shadow that possesses destructive power, while the integrated shadow becomes a source of vitality and creativity. The businessman who owns his aggression becomes more effective than one who projects it onto competitors. The caregiver who acknowledges selfish needs becomes more genuinely generous than one who gives from depletion and resentment. The spiritual seeker who integrates worldly desires becomes more authentically transcendent than one who achieves detachment through suppression. The shadow's dark invitation is ultimately an invitation to psychological courage, the courage to be more rather than less than what you have imagined yourself to be, to include rather than exclude aspects of human nature that conventional wisdom deems unacceptable. It asks you to become what Jung called a container for the opposites, capable of holding paradox without splitting, complexity without simplification, humanity without sanitization. This capacity for containing opposites is the foundation of what depth psychology calls the transcendent function, the ability to create new syntheses from apparently irreconcilable conflicts. It is the hallmark of psychological maturity, the fruit of successful individuation, the prerequisite for genuine wisdom. Yet it can only be developed through direct engagement with the shadow material that consciousness has worked so hard to avoid. As you begin to accept the shadow's invitation, you discover that what seemed like darkness often contains the seeds of previously unimaginable light. The aspects of self you have most feared encountering prove to be guardians of treasures you did not know you possessed. The qualities you have spent your life avoiding become, when properly integrated, sources of power and authenticity you never knew were available. But integration is only the beginning. as the shadow begins to yield its secrets, as the rejected aspects of self find their proper place in the economy of the whole person, consciousness prepares for an even more profound encounter, the descent into what alchemical tradition calls the negrado, the darkening that precedes transformation, the psychological death that must occur before authentic rebirth becomes possible. The shadow has extended its invitation, and you have found the courage to accept. Now begins the real work of transformation, the journey into the depths where death and rebirth dance their eternal spiral, where the old self must dissolve completely before the new self can emerge from the darkness like dawn breaking over a landscape that has never before been seen. In the ancient laboratories where alchemists pursued the great work, the negrado marked the moment when base metals dissolved into primordial darkness, their familiar forms lost to putrefaction so complete that only faith sustained the belief that gold might eventually emerge from such apparent destruction. This blackening, this necessary decomposition, this descent into the void where all previous certainties turn to ash, this is where you now find yourself as the shadow's integration gives way to something far more profound and terrifying than mere psychological adjustment. You have entered the negrado of the soul, that phase of transformation where death is not metaphor, but lived reality, where the ego does not simply change, but experiences its own dissolution, with all the terror and disorientation that actual dying brings. This is the dark night that mystics have written about, across cultures and centuries, the necessary darkness that precedes authentic rebirth, the psychological death that must be endured before genuine individuation can begin. The descent into negrado does not announce itself with fanfare or provide clear maps for navigation. It creeps in like fog at twilight, gradually obscuring landmarks that have guided your journey since consciousness first learned to organize experience into manageable categories. One day, you wake to discover that the life you have been living feels like a costume you can no longer bear to wear, the roles you have been playing like scripts written in a language you no longer speak, the very foundations of identity as insubstantial as morning mist that dissolves at the first touch of direct sunlight. This dissolution begins where shadow integration leaves off, for once you have acknowledged the rejected aspects of your nature, once you have begun the work of reclaiming what was banished to the unconscious depths, consciousness can no longer maintain the illusion of its own completeness or control. The careful boundaries between self and other, known and unknown, acceptable and forbidden, begin to blur and merge like watercolors left too long in rain. The ego, faced with this dissolution of its carefully maintained order, responds with the desperation of an organism fighting for survival. It mobilizes every available defense, recruiting allies from memory and imagination, from obligation and distraction, from any source that might restore the familiar sense of solid identity navigating a predictable world. Yet the more frantically it struggles against the dissolution, the more complete the dissolution becomes, like quicksand that swallows more completely those who fight against its embrace. This is the cruel paradox of the negrado, that the very qualities that enabled survival and success in the previous phase of development become obstacles to the transformation that consciousness now demands. The ability to maintain control that once felt like strength now reveals itself as rigidity that prevents necessary change. The capacity for rational analysis that once provided clarity now becomes a prison that separates you from direct encounter with reality. The social skills that once enabled connection now feel like elaborate performances that prevent authentic meeting with others or yourself. In the depths of this psychological putrefaction, familiar emotions lose their recognizable forms, and transform into something both more primitive and more essential. Sadness deepens into a grief so profound it seems to mourn not just personal losses but the entire human condition, the tragedy of consciousness awakening to its own temporary nature. Anger transmutes into a rage that encompasses not just individual frustrations, but the cosmic injustice of beings capable of imagining perfection, trapped within the constraints of mortal existence. Joy, when it appears at all, carries with it such poignancy that it becomes indistinguishable from sorrow, for it illuminates with heartbreaking clarity everything that is beautiful and everything that must eventually be lost. The rational mind, trained to solve problems through analysis and action, finds itself completely inadequate to the task of navigating this dissolution. Every attempt to think your way out of the negrado only deepens your immersion in its darkness, like struggling in a tar pit where movement generates more entanglement rather than freedom. The tools that consciousness has developed over decades of experience, planning, goal setting, positive thinking, problem solving, not only fail to provide relief, but actually intensify the sense of being lost in territory that operates according to laws older than rational thought. In this darkness, you encounter what Jung recognized as the fundamental terror that drives most human psychological development, the fear of non-being, of dissolution back into the undifferentiated unity from which individual consciousness originally emerged. The ego, which has spent its entire existence believing itself to be synonymous with your true identity, experiences this dissolution as literal death. Every familiar reference point disappears into the void. Every cherished belief reveals itself as provisional construction. Every assumed truth crumbles like ancient parchment exposed to air. Yet it is precisely in this experience of psychological death that the possibility of authentic rebirth is concealed, like a seed that must decompose completely before it can give birth to new life. The negrado strips away not just the persona and its careful constructions, but also the ego's assumption that it represents the totality of what you are. In the darkness of complete dissolution, something that was always present but never recognized begins to stir, not the constructed self that has been dying, but the eternal self that can neither be born nor die, but simply is. This stirring is felt initially not as presence, but as absence, not as light, but as darkness so complete that it becomes luminous, not as being, but as the void from which all being emerges and to which it returns. The mystics have always known that the divine reveals itself most clearly, not in the light that blinds, but in the darkness that clarifies, not in the fullness that overwhelms, but in the emptiness that makes room for what cannot be contained by any construction of human understanding. In the depths of negrado, ordinary time dissolves along with ordinary identity. Minutes stretch into eternities while years collapse into moments. The linear progression that usually organizes experience gives way to a cyclical awareness, where past and future spiral around a present moment so vast and empty that it contains all possibilities and none. Memory becomes unreliable, releasing its careful chronology and allowing forgotten experiences to surface with the vividness of current reality, while recent events fade like dreams upon waking. The body, too, participates in this dissolution, often manifesting symptoms that medical science struggles to categorize or treat. Chronic exhaustion that no amount of rest can relieve, aches and pains that shift location like nomads refusing to settle, sensations of emptiness so profound they seem to hollow out the very substance of physical existence. These are not signs of illness, but of transformation, the body's participation in a process that encompasses every level of being from the molecular to the mythic. Sleep, when it comes at all, brings not rest but deeper immersion in the negrado's strange geographies. Dreams become more real than waking life, carrying you through landscapes that exist nowhere on earthly maps, yet feel more familiar than any place you have ever lived. In these nocturnal journeys, you encounter figures from your deepest unconscious, wise women who speak in riddles, shadow kings who rule over kingdoms of forgotten emotion, divine children who play games whose rules encompass the entire cosmos. These dream figures offer no easy comfort or quick solutions, but serve as guides through the dissolution process, teaching consciousness how to navigate territory where ordinary logic provides no purchase. They speak in the language of symbol and metaphor, offering images that bypass rational understanding and plant themselves directly in the soil of deep knowing. A blackbird that carries messages between worlds, a dried-up well that must be emptied completely before fresh water can spring from depths previously unimagined. A mirror that shows not your face, but the face you wore before you were born. The social world during this phase becomes increasingly difficult to navigate, for the dissolution of internal structure makes it nearly impossible to maintain the performances that social interaction requires. Conversations feel like elaborate charades whose point you can no longer remember. Professional obligations become surreal theater where you watch yourself playing a role while simultaneously knowing that the player is disappearing even as the performance continues. Relationships strain under the weight of your inability to be who others expect you to be, who you yourself expect you to be, who anyone expects anyone to be. Family members and friends witnessing this dissolution with alarm often mobilize to rescue you from what they perceive as dangerous territory. They offer advice drawn from their own experience with lesser transformations, suggest therapies designed to restore rather than transcend previous functioning, propose activities and distractions meant to pull you back from the edge of an abyss they cannot see but instinctively fear. Their good intentions feel like hands trying to pull you from water when you have not yet learned to swim, but know somehow that touching bottom is the only way to find the strength to rise. This well-meaning interference often intensifies the isolation that characterizes the negrado phase, for you find yourself unable to explain what you are experiencing to people who interpret psychological dissolution as pathology rather than process. The language needed to describe the negrado does not exist in ordinary discourse, which lacks vocabulary for states of being that transcend individual identity while remaining consciously experienced. You find yourself becoming increasingly silent, not from depression but from the impossibility of translating inner reality into forms that consensus consciousness can comprehend. Yet in this isolation, in this silence, in this descent into darkness so complete that darkness itself becomes transparent, something unprecedented begins to occur. The dissolution that seemed to threaten complete annihilation reveals itself as preparation for a mode of being that was inconceivable from the perspective of ordinary ego consciousness. Like a snake that must shed its skin completely before it can grow, like a butterfly that must dissolve entirely within the chrysalis before emerging in wholly new form, consciousness discovers that what felt like death was actually the labor pains of a birth beyond all previous imagining, the turning point in the negrado, if such linear language can be applied to a process that unfolds in dimensions beyond temporal sequence, comes not through effort or intention, but through exhaustion so complete that all struggling ceases. When the ego has finally depleted every strategy for maintaining control, when consciousness has surrendered every attempt to manage or direct the dissolution process, when the personality has admitted its complete inability to navigate these waters through any means at its disposal, Then something else begins to emerge from the depths. This emergence is not the return of what was lost, but the appearance of what was never absent, the eternal self that exists beyond all construction and dissolution, the consciousness that remains aware even when everything it was aware of disappears, the being that needs no identity because it is identical with existence itself. This self does not appear as an object to be grasped or understood, but as the very awareness through which all grasping and understanding occur. The recognition of this self is simultaneously the most ordinary and most extraordinary experience possible to human consciousness. Ordinary because it is what you have always been, beneath every layer of conditioning and construction, as natural as breathing, as present as the awareness that reads these words. Extraordinary because it reveals that everything you thought you knew about yourself was not false but incomplete, like mistaking a wave for the entire ocean or a dream figure for the dreamer. This recognition does not end the negrado, but transforms its meaning entirely. The dissolution continues, but instead of being experienced as loss or destruction, it is recognized as the clearing away of obstacles to what has always been present. The darkness remains, but it is no longer the darkness of absence, but the darkness of mystery, the fertile void from which all forms emerge and to which they return in the eternal dance of manifestation and dissolution. From this perspective, the psychological death that seemed so terrifying reveals itself as no death at all, but the end of a misunderstanding so fundamental that its correction requires the complete restructuring of consciousness itself. What was dying was not your true nature, but your identification with what was never more than a temporary construction, a useful fiction that served its purpose in the development of individual awareness, but became an obstacle when that awareness was ready to recognize its true scope and nature. The negrado, then, is not punishment or pathology, but initiation into a mode of being that transcends the ordinary alternation between birth and death, construction and destruction, self and other. It is the dark passage through which consciousness must travel to discover that it was never as small or separate or mortal as it imagined itself to be. It is the necessary dissolution that reveals the indestructible essence hidden within every form that can be dissolved. As this recognition deepens, as consciousness learns to rest in its own eternal nature while allowing the play of form to continue unimpeded, the stage is set for what alchemical tradition calls the albedo, the whitening that follows the blackening, the emergence of purified consciousness from the ashes of ego dissolution, the dawn that breaks over a landscape transformed not through addition, but through the removal of everything that was never essential to begin with. But that dawn lies ahead, beyond the current darkness, for now consciousness rests in the depths of the negrado, learning to breathe underwater, to see in darkness, to die while remaining alive, to discover that what seemed like the end was always, in truth, the beginning of a journey that has no end because it never truly began, having always been the eternal movement of what is into ever deeper recognition of its own infinite nature. The psychological death is complete, and from its ashes, something unprecedented prepares to emerge into the light of a new day that has never dawned before and will never dawn again. For each moment of authentic awakening is the first moment of creation, the original dawn breaking over a world made new by consciousness, finally recognizing its own true face reflected in everything it perceives. In the cathedral of sleep, where consciousness surrenders its vigilant watch and the ego's fortress walls grow thin, another voice begins to speak. It whispers in a tongue older than words, paints pictures more vivid than waking sight, and tells stories that the rational mind would dismiss as nonsense, yet the soul recognizes as profound truth. These are our dreams, the nightly correspondence between the known self and the vast, mysterious realm that Jung called the unconscious. When we close our eyes and slip beneath the surface of ordinary awareness, we enter a domain where time moves like honey, where the impossible becomes inevitable, where our grandmother who died 20 years ago sits at our kitchen table offering wisdom we desperately need to hear. The ego, that daytime monarch of logic and control, lies dormant, and in its absence, the deeper psyche unfolds like a night-blooming flower, releasing fragrances of meaning that can only be detected by the soul's more subtle senses. Dreams come to us as letters written in a symbolic script that predates the invention of language itself. They arrive bearing the stamp of the unconscious, that vast postal service of the psyche that operates according to its own mysterious schedule. Some dreams flutter into awareness like gentle butterflies, their messages soft and barely remembered upon waking. Others crash through our sleep like thunderbolts, leaving us gasping and transformed, their images seared into memory with an intensity that speaks of something sacred attempting to break through. The ego, in its waking arrogance, often dismisses these nocturnal visitations as mere neural housekeeping, the brain's way of sorting the day's experiences like a cosmic filing clerk. But Jung understood that dreams serve a far more profound purpose. They are the psyche's attempt to restore balance, to compensate for the one-sided attitudes and blind spots that accumulate during our conscious hours. If we have been too rigid in our thinking, dreams may offer us fluidity. If we have been too ethereal, they ground us in earthy, even crude imagery. If we have been too focused on the external world, they turn our attention inward to neglected aspects of our inner landscape. This compensatory function of dreams reveals the inherent wisdom of the unconscious, a wisdom that operates not through the linear logic beloved by the ego, but through the deeper intelligence of symbol and metaphor. The dream doesn't argue with us. It doesn't present reasoned cases for why we should change our attitudes or behaviors. Instead, it offers us experiences that bypass our psychological defenses entirely, speaking directly to the parts of ourselves that understand meaning through feeling, through image, through the mysterious resonance between symbol and soul. Consider the executive who dreams repeatedly of being chased by a wild animal through dark woods. His ego might protest that this makes no sense. He leads a civilized life, works in a gleaming office tower, has never encountered anything more threatening than a difficult client. But the dream persists, night after night, the beast drawing closer, the woods growing thicker, until finally he can no longer dismiss the urgency of the message. Perhaps his unconscious is trying to tell him that something wild and instinctual within him has been ignored for too long, that his carefully controlled existence has left no room for the vital, untamed energies that seek expression. The chase in the dream may represent not a threat to be feared, but a neglected aspect of himself that demands acknowledgement. Or consider the woman who dreams of standing before a locked door, keys scattered at her feet, none of them fitting the lock. Night after night she tries key after key, growing more frustrated until she wakes with a sense of profound futility. Her waking life seems successful enough. Good job, stable relationship, comfortable home. But the dream suggests that somewhere in her psyche there is a room that remains inaccessible, a part of herself locked away from conscious awareness. Perhaps it contains creative gifts she has never explored, or feelings she has never allowed herself to experience, or potentials she has never dared to actualize. The scattered keys might represent all the various approaches she has tried to unlock these hidden chambers of the self, none quite right because she has been looking for external solutions to what is fundamentally an inner mystery. The beauty of dream symbolism lies in its multi-layered nature. Unlike the precise definitions of waking language, dream images shimmer with multiple meanings, each valid, each offering a different facet of the total truth the unconscious is attempting to convey. The house that appears in dreams might simultaneously represent the dreamer's psyche, their family history, their sense of security, their relationship with the feminine principle, and their connection to the collective unconscious. This polyvalent quality of dream symbols reflects the holistic nature of unconscious wisdom. It doesn't parcel out meaning in neat, separate packages, but offers rich, integrated communications that speak to the whole person. Jung discovered that dreams often come in series, like chapters in a book, each building upon the themes and symbols of those that came before. The psyche, it seems, is remarkably persistent in its attempts to guide us toward greater wholeness. If we ignore the gentle whisper of one dream, it may speak more loudly in the next. If we dismiss the symbolic warning, it may present us with increasingly dramatic scenarios until we finally pay attention. This progressive quality of dream series suggests that the unconscious has its own agenda for our development, an agenda that may not always align with the ego's preferences, but consistently points toward what Jung called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who we truly are. The language of dreams is the language of the soul, and like any language, it requires patience and practice to understand. The ego, accustomed to the straightforward communications of waking life, often grows frustrated with the dream's refusal to speak plainly. Why can't it just tell me what I need to know? The rational mind demands. But the unconscious operates according to different principles. It understands that the deepest truths cannot be simply transmitted like information in a memo. They must be experienced, felt, integrated at levels far deeper than intellectual comprehension. This is why dreams so often present us with experiences rather than explanations. Instead of telling us that we need to confront our shadow, they place us in scenarios where we encounter dark, threatening figures. Instead of informing us that we have neglected our spiritual life, they take us into sacred spaces, churches, temples, mystical landscapes, where the divine presence is palpable. Instead of lecturing us about the need for psychological integration, they show us images of marriage, of reunion, of separate elements coming together in new combinations. The emotional tone of dreams often provides crucial information about the message they carry. A dream suffused with anxiety might indicate that some aspect of our psychological development is being resisted or feared. A dream filled with joy and liberation might suggest that we are moving in the right direction, aligning more closely with our authentic nature. Dreams that evoke profound sadness or grief might be helping us process losses we haven't fully mourned, or alerting us to parts of ourselves that are dying or need to die. For new growth to occur, sometimes dreams carry us back to childhood homes, to schools we attended decades ago, to people from our past who seem to have faded from relevance. The ego might wonder why the unconscious bothers with such apparent nostalgia. But these returns to the past often serve important psychological functions. They may be pointing to unfinished business, to patterns established in childhood that continue to influence our adult lives, or to qualities we possessed in youth that we have since abandoned but now need to reclaim. The child who appears in dreams is rarely just a memory of who we once were. More often, this figure represents the eternal child within us, that part of the psyche that remains fresh, curious, spontaneous, and open to wonder. If this inner child appears wounded or frightened in our dreams, it might suggest that our natural vitality has been damaged by life's hardships. If the dream child is joyful and free, it might indicate that we are successfully maintaining connection with our essential aliveness, despite the responsibilities and sorrows of adult existence. Animals in dreams carry their own unique power, often representing instinctual energies that have been domesticated, suppressed, or forgotten in our civilized existence. The bear might symbolize the need for periods of withdrawal and hibernation, the wisdom of knowing when to retreat from the world's demands. The bird might represent spiritual aspirations, the longing for transcendence, or thoughts and ideas that seek expression. The snake, perhaps the most powerful dream symbol of all, often signifies transformation, healing, or the emergence of ancient wisdom from the depths of the psyche. Water appears in dreams with remarkable frequency, taking forms that range from gentle streams to raging oceans, from refreshing showers to threatening floods. Jung understood water as a symbol of the unconscious itself, sometimes nurturing and life-giving, sometimes overwhelming and dangerous, always representing depths that extend far beyond what the conscious mind can fathom. The quality of the water in dreams often reflects our current relationship with our own unconscious material. Clear, flowing water might suggest that we are in good contact with our inner life, while muddy or stagnant water might indicate that unconscious contents have become contaminated by neglect or repression. Death appears in dreams not as the literal end of life, but as the psychological necessity of endings that make new beginnings possible. The ego, terrified of any form of dissolution, may interpret dream deaths as ominous predictions, but the unconscious understands what the ego often cannot, that growth requires the continuous death and rebirth of outmoded aspects of the personality. The dream death might represent the end of an old way of being, the dissolution of a limiting identity, or the necessary sacrifice of something familiar to make room for something more authentic. Flying dreams offer some of the most exhilarating experiences the unconscious can provide. In these moments of dream flight, we taste the freedom that lies beyond the ego's earthbound concerns. We soar above the landscapes of limitation, experiencing our potential for transcendence. Yet Jung cautioned against interpreting such dreams as mere wish fulfillment or escapism. True psychological flight represents the achievement of perspective, the ability to rise above the immediate pressures and problems of daily existence, to see the larger patterns and purposes at work in our lives. Falling dreams, by contrast, often emerge when we have become too inflated, too disconnected from our human limitations and earthy foundations. The unconscious pulls us back down to earth, reminding us that sustainable growth requires roots as well as branches, that psychological development must be grounded in honest acknowledgement of our finite mortal nature. The house that appears in dreams almost always represents the self in its various dimensions. Different rooms might symbolize different aspects of personality, different levels of consciousness, different potentials waiting to be explored or developed. The basement often represents the unconscious, sometimes appearing as a dark, frightening space filled with things we prefer not to examine, other times revealing itself as a treasure house of forgotten resources and hidden capabilities. The upper floors of the dream house might represent our aspirations, our spiritual longings, our highest potentials, sometimes accessible and inviting, sometimes locked away or under construction. Discovering new rooms in familiar houses ranks among the most common and meaningful dream experiences. These newly revealed spaces often represent aspects of ourselves that we haven't yet recognized or developed. The dream shows us that we contain more than we previously imagined, that our psychological house has dimensions we have yet to explore. Sometimes these rooms are beautiful and inviting, filled with light and possibility. Other times they are dusty and neglected, requiring cleaning and renovation before they can be inhabited. Both variations point to the same essential truth. that the self is far vaster than the ego supposes, containing potentials that await recognition and development. People from our past who appear in dreams rarely represent themselves in any literal sense. Instead, they embody qualities, energies, or relationships that remain active in our psychological life. The former lover might represent our capacity for passion and intimacy. The harsh teacher might symbolize our inner critic or our relationship with authority. The deceased grandparent might carry wisdom traditions and ancestral knowledge that we need to integrate. The key to understanding these dream figures lies not in analyzing their actual personalities or our historical relationships with them, but in recognizing what aspects of ourselves they represent and what messages they might be carrying from the unconscious. Sometimes dreams present us with unknown figures, strangers who nonetheless feel familiar, mysterious guides who seem to know more about our lives than we do ourselves. These figures often represent aspects of the self, that deeper organizing principle that Jung understood as the center and circumference of the total personality. When such figures appear in dreams, they often offer guidance, wisdom, or challenges that come from beyond the ego's limited perspective. They speak with the authority of the deeper self, pointing toward possibilities and potentials that the conscious mind might never have considered. The numinous quality that surrounds certain dream experiences indicates that we are in contact with something larger than personal psychology. These dreams carry an atmosphere of the sacred, leaving us with the unmistakable sense that we have encountered mystery itself. Such dreams might present us with luminous landscapes, divine figures, or symbolic scenarios that seem to pulse with meaning we can feel but cannot fully articulate. Jung understood these numinous dreams as moments when the personal unconscious opens onto the collective unconscious, connecting us with the archetypal foundations of human experience. Nightmares, though frightening to the ego, often carry some of the most important messages the unconscious has to offer. They represent situations, emotions, or aspects of ourselves that we have been unwilling to face consciously. The psyche, in its wisdom, presents these difficult truths in dramatic, impossible-to-ignore forms, forcing us to encounter what we would otherwise avoid. The monster that pursues us through the nightmare landscape might represent our own suppressed rage, our unacknowledged sexuality, our fear of death, or our terror of meaninglessness. By facing these figures in the protected space of the dream, we begin the process of integrating the rejected aspects of ourselves. Recurring dreams deserve special attention, for they indicate that the unconscious has a persistent message that we have not yet received or integrated. The same scenario, the same symbols, the same emotional tone appears night after night, sometimes for years, until we finally understand what our deeper self is trying to communicate. These repetitive dreams often cease abruptly once their message has been grasped and acted upon, as if the unconscious, satisfied that its communication has finally been received, moves on to other matters. The timing of significant dreams often corresponds with crucial transitions in our outer lives. Dreams of death and rebirth may cluster around career changes, relationship endings, or major life transitions. Dreams of integration and wholeness may emerge during periods when we are successfully bringing together previously conflicted aspects of ourselves. Dreams of guidance and direction often appear when we are facing important decisions or standing at crossroads in our development. This synchronization between inner dream life and outer circumstances suggests that the unconscious maintains intimate awareness of our total life situation, offering its wisdom precisely when we most need guidance. Understanding dreams requires a shift from the ego's demand for literal interpretation to the soul's appreciation for symbolic truth. A dream about failing an examination rarely predicts actual academic failure. More likely, it reflects our anxiety about being tested or evaluated in some area of life, our fear of not measuring up to our own or others' standards, or our sense of being unprepared for the challenges we face. The dream doesn't lie to us, but it speaks in the metaphorical language natural to the unconscious. Working with dreams becomes an act of translation, a sacred hermeneutics that seeks to bridge the gap between the unconscious symbolic communications and the ego's need for understanding. This work requires patience, humility, and a willingness to be surprised by meanings we never would have anticipated. Often, the most powerful dream insights come not through intellectual analysis, but through a kind of meditative dialogue with the dream images themselves, allowing them to speak to us directly rather than forcing them into preconceived interpretations. The practice of dream work gradually transforms our relationship with the unconscious from one of ignorance or fear to one of respectful dialogue. We begin to recognize the unconscious not as an enemy of consciousness, but as its complement and guide. We learn to trust the intelligence that operates in our dreams, especially when, that intelligence challenges our conscious assumptions and preferences. In learning the language of dreams, we reconnect with a way of knowing that our ancestors took for granted, but that modern consciousness has largely forgotten. We remember that truth can be conveyed through image as well as concept, through feeling as well as analysis, through the mysterious logic of symbol, as well as the linear progression of rational thought. Dreams restore us to our full humanity, reminding us that we are not merely thinking machines, but embodied souls capable of receiving wisdom through channels more subtle and profound than the ego's narrow bandwidth of awareness. As we become more fluent in the language of dreams, we may notice that the boundary between sleeping and waking consciousness begins to soften. The symbolic awareness that dreams cultivate starts to infuse our daytime experience, helping us recognize the metaphorical dimensions of everyday events. We begin to see that our outer lives, too, are filled with symbols, synchronicities, and meaningful patterns that reflect the deeper movements of the psyche. The dream becomes not just a nightly experience, but a way of seeing, a way of being in relationship with the mystery that enfolds and shapes our existence. The letters that arrive from the unconscious through our dreams are ultimately love letters, communications from the deepest parts of ourselves that seek nothing more than our wholeness, our authenticity, our full participation in the magnificent complexity of being human. They come to us with infinite patience, night after night, year after year, carrying their cargo of wisdom and healing until we finally learn to receive them with the gratitude and reverence they deserve. In opening ourselves to their messages, we open ourselves to the transformative relationship between consciousness and the unconscious that Jung understood as the very heart of individuation, the sacred process of becoming who we truly are. In the deepest chambers of the psyche, where consciousness meets the vast unknown, there dwells a mysterious figure, part lover, part guide, part mirror of all that we are not yet brave enough to become. This is the contrasexual archetype, the inner other that Jung named the Animma in men and the animus in women. It is the soul's own beloved, the eternal feminine within masculine consciousness, the eternal masculine within feminine awareness, calling us toward a completeness that the ego, in its narrow certainty, cannot even imagine. Listen closely, for in the stirring of this inner presence lies one of the most profound mysteries of human transformation. The anima and animus are not mere psychological concepts to be studied from a distance. They are living forces within us, breathing entities that whisper through our dreams, speak through our attractions, and beckon us toward encounters that will either elevate our consciousness or drag us into the depths of possession and projection. The anima appears first in man's psyche as an ethereal presence, a feminine essence that carries all the qualities his conscious personality has rejected, ignored, or never dared to claim. She is the receptive where he has been aggressive, the intuitive where he has insisted on logic, the feeling-toned where he has armored himself in thinking. In the beginning, she dwells in the shadows of his awareness, manifesting through inexplicable moods that seem to rise from nowhere, through artistic inspirations that surprise him with their depth, through moments of unexpected tenderness that crack open his carefully constructed masculine facade. Yet the anima is far more than a collection of rejected feminine qualities. She is the personification of the unconscious itself, the guardian of the threshold between known and unknown realms. She appears in dreams as the mysterious woman who leads him down underground passages, as the wise woman who speaks in riddles, as the seductress who promises forbidden knowledge, as the divine feminine who offers redemption through relationship to the sacred. In waking life, she constellates around actual women, projecting her archetypal energy onto lovers, wives, muses, and goddesses, creating those fateful attractions that feel less like choice than destiny. The ego, still trapped in its literal understanding of love and relationship, mistakes these projections for the women themselves. It falls in love with its own anima, clothed in the flesh of another, and wonders why no human being can ever fulfill the promise of transcendence that the projections seem to offer. The man finds himself possessed by inexplicable passions, driven to pursue women who embody his anima's particular constellation, the elusive beauty who seems to hold the key to his soul, the mysterious woman who appears to understand depths of himself he has never explored, the creative feminine who seems to promise access to realms of imagination and feeling he has always longed to enter. But projection is a double-edged sword. While it may bring the unconscious content into the light of relationship, it also imprisons both lover and beloved in archetypal patterns that have little to do with their actual humanity. The woman becomes not herself, but a screen upon which the man's inner feminine is displayed. She is worshipped as goddess or condemned as witch, idealized as savior or demonized as destroyer, but rarely seen simply as the complex, evolving human being she actually is. Meanwhile, the anima herself, denied direct relationship with consciousness, grows restless and demanding. She may express her frustration through dark moods that descend without warning, through creative blocks that seem to wall off access to inspiration, through a sense of meaninglessness that no external achievement can touch. She may manifest as the inner critic who speaks in a woman's voice, berating the man for his failures to live up to some impossible feminine ideal, or as the seductress who tempts him away from his conscious commitments toward adventures that promise soul connection but deliver only chaos. The animus in woman's psyche follows a parallel but distinct pattern. Where the anima appears as mood and image, the animus often manifests as voice and opinion. He is the inner masculine that carries all the qualities her conscious feminine identity has rejected or never been allowed to develop. The assertive where she has been yielding, the analytical where she has lived in the realm of feeling, the independent where she has defined herself through relationship. In his most primitive form, the animus appears as the voice of absolute conviction, the inner judge who knows exactly what is right and wrong, true and false, valuable and worthless. He speaks with the authority of eternal principles, brooking no discussion, no nuance, no consideration of context or complexity. This is the animus of rigid opinions, of black and white thinking, of pronouncements delivered with such certainty that they seem to brook no contradiction. Yet, like the anima, the animus is far more than a collection of projected masculine qualities. He is the bridge between the feminine ego and the vast transpersonal realm of ideas, principles, and spiritual meaning. In his more developed form, he appears as the inner guide who can navigate the world of concepts and abstractions, the wise king who can discern true value from mere fashion, the spiritual warrior who can stand for truth even when it requires standing alone. The animus may first make himself known through a woman's attractions to men who embody certain archetypal patterns, the hero who promises adventure and meaning, the wise man who seems to hold the keys to understanding, the rebel who represents freedom from conventional constraints, the king who offers protection and status. In each case, the woman may find herself drawn not to the man himself, but to the projection of her own inner masculine potential, seeking in relationship what she has not yet learned to provide for herself. The tragedy of animus possession is that it can make a woman rigid where she might be strong, opinionated where she might be wise, demanding where she might be discerning. Under the animus's influence, she may become the voice of harsh judgment, criticizing others with the very severity that her own inner masculine voice uses against her undeveloped potentials. She may find herself arguing positions she doesn't fully understand, driven by the animus's need to be right rather than her own genuine convictions. Yet both anima and animus, for all their capacity to create projection and possession, carry within them the seeds of profound psychological development. They are not obstacles to be overcome, but inner figures to be recognized, related to, and gradually integrated into the larger symphony of the psyche. The path toward such integration begins with the humbling recognition that what we thought we found in the other, we were actually seeking within ourselves. This recognition often arrives through the bitter medicine of disillusionment. The goddess proves to be human after all, complete with fears, limitations, and shadow qualities that shatter the projection. The hero reveals himself to be as lost and seeking as anyone else, unable to carry the weight of archetypal expectation. The relationship that promised to complete the missing parts of ourselves instead mirrors back our own incompleteness, demanding that we take responsibility for our own development rather than seeking it through merger with another. Such disillusionment, though painful, opens the door to a different kind of relationship, both with the inner anima or animus and with actual human beings. Instead of seeking the other to complete us, we begin the slow work of dialogue with the contrasexual archetype within our own psyche. Instead of demanding that our partners carry our projections, we begin to recognize when we are seeing them through the lens of our own unrealized potentials. The process of anima integration for the man begins with learning to recognize her voice, her moods, her particular way of moving through his inner landscape. She may speak through sudden inspirations that arise during moments of receptive silence, through aesthetic experiences that touch depths beyond rational understanding, through dreams that reveal emotional truths his thinking function has missed. Learning to listen to her requires developing what Jung called the feeling function, not mere emotionality, but the capacity to discern value, meaning, and significance in the subtle realm of relationship and connection. As the man learns to dialogue with his anima rather than project her onto women, something remarkable begins to happen. The outer women in his life begin to emerge from behind the veils of projection, revealing themselves as complete human beings with their own struggles, gifts, and paths of development. Relationship becomes less about finding the missing half of oneself and more about two whole beings choosing to share their journeys toward greater consciousness. The anima, no longer desperate for recognition through projection, begins to reveal her deeper gifts. She becomes the guide who can navigate the realm of the unconscious, the muse who can inspire genuine creativity, the feeling function that can discern what truly matters from what merely appears important. She becomes the bridge between the man's conscious achievements and the deeper sources of meaning that give life its genuine value. For the woman working with animus integration, the path requires learning to distinguish between the voice of genuine inner authority and the compulsive need to be right that characterizes animus possession. The authentic animus speaks not from rigid conviction, but from lived experience, not from borrowed opinions, but from hard-won wisdom, not from the need to dominate, but from the capacity to discern and uphold genuine value. As the woman develops a conscious relationship with her animus, she discovers that he can become a powerful ally in navigating the world of ideas, principles, and meaning-making. Rather than possessing her with absolute opinions, he can help her develop the capacity for genuine discrimination, the ability to stand for her convictions without being rigid, the strength to venture into territories of thought and action that her feminine identity alone might find intimidating. The integrated animus becomes the inner masculine that can protect and serve the feminine values of relationship, creativity, and connection rather than opposing them. He becomes the wise king who can create order without destroying life, the warrior who can fight for what matters without becoming trapped in endless conflict, the sage who can offer guidance without demanding submission. But perhaps the most profound aspect of Animma and animus work lies in what Jung called the conjunctio, the sacred marriage of opposites that occurs when the masculine and feminine principles within the psyche learn to dance together in conscious harmony. This is not the elimination of gender distinctions, but the recognition that both masculine and feminine archetypal energies live within every human being, regardless of biological sex or social gender identity. The sacred marriage is not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing process of creative tension and dynamic balance. The masculine principle of focused consciousness learns to honor the feminine principle of receptive awareness. The feminine capacity for relationship and connection learns to embrace the masculine gift of discrimination and direction. Neither dominates the other. Instead, they engage in the eternal dance of opposition that generates the creative energy necessary for continued psychological growth. This inner marriage transforms one's approach to outer relationships. Instead of seeking completion through merger with another, one enters relationship from a place of relative wholeness, offering one's gifts while remaining open to the growth that genuine encounter with otherness can bring. The beloved becomes not the missing piece of oneself, but a mysterious other whose very otherness can catalyze new depths of self-discovery. The anima and animus also serve as mediators between the personal and transpersonal dimensions of experience. Through relationship with these inner figures, one begins to touch the archetypal layer of the psyche where individual psychology intersects with the eternal patterns that have shaped human consciousness throughout history. The anima connects the man to the eternal feminine principle that appears in countless forms throughout mythology and religion: the Great Mother, the Divine Bride, the Sophia or wisdom figure who offers gnosis through relationship. The animus connects the woman to the eternal masculine principle that manifests as the wise king, the spiritual warrior, the logos or principle of meaning that can provide structure for the soul's deepest values. Yet this connection to archetypal energies must be balanced with grounded humanity. The anima must not become an excuse for moody self-indulgence or an escape from the practical demands of life. The animus must not become a source of inflation or a weapon for attacking others' perceived inadequacies. Both must be held in the tension between transcendent possibility and incarnate responsibility, between archetypal truth and human limitation. The work with anima and animus requires tremendous patience and self-compassion. These archetypal figures cannot be forced into consciousness through will or effort. They must be courted, listened to, gradually understood through the slow accumulation of experience and reflection. They speak in the language of symbol and image, mood and intuition, sudden inspiration and gradual recognition. Learning their language requires developing what Jung called the symbolic attitude, the capacity to experience meaning that cannot be reduced to literal explanation. Dreams become particularly important in this work, as they provide a natural theater where anima and animus figures can appear without the interference of conscious expectations. The mysterious woman who appears in a man's dreams, the unknown masculine figure who guides a woman through dreamscapes of transformation. These are often direct manifestations of the contrasexual archetype, offering guidance that the conscious mind alone cannot provide. Active imagination also becomes a crucial tool for developing relationship with these inner figures. Through conscious fantasy and dialogue, one can engage with anima or animus directly, asking questions, receiving guidance, gradually building a relationship that can support the process of integration. This is not escapism, but rather a sophisticated form of psychological work that recognizes the reality and autonomy of these archetypal energies within the psyche. As the relationship with anima or animus deepens, one begins to experience what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposites in creative tension without being torn apart by their contradiction. The masculine and feminine principles within the psyche learn to complement rather than oppose each other, generating a third thing that transcends both while including the essential gifts of each. This integration has profound implications for creativity. The man who has developed conscious relationship with his anima often finds that his creative work takes on depths of feeling and meaning that were previously inaccessible. The woman who has integrated her animus may discover new capacities for bringing her creative visions into concrete form, for standing behind her work with authority and conviction. The process also affects one's relationship to power and authority. The man learns to wield power in service of life-giving rather than life-denying purposes, tempering strength with compassion, direction with receptivity. The woman learns to claim her authority without apology while remaining connected to the relational values that give authority its ethical foundation. Perhaps most importantly, the integration of anima and animus prepares the psyche for what Jung saw as the ultimate goal of individuation, the realization of the self. As the ego learns to dance consciously with the contrasexual archetype, it develops the capacity to relate to the even more numinous energies that represent the totality of the psyche. The anima and animus become not ends in themselves, but waypoints on the journey toward the sacred marriage that unites all opposites within the comprehensive wholeness of the self. But this work is never complete, never finished. The anima and animus continue to evolve throughout life, presenting new challenges and possibilities as consciousness itself deepens and expands. The mysterious woman who appeared in youth may transform into the wise crone in later life. The heroic animus of early adulthood may give way to the sage or the fool, as experience teaches the limits of conventional achievements. The key is to remain in conscious relationship with these evolving archetypal energies, neither identifying with them completely nor rejecting them entirely. They are partners in the great work of becoming who we truly are, allies in the journey toward the wholeness that includes but transcends all partial identities and limited self-concepts. In our time, when traditional gender roles are being questioned and transformed, the work with anima and animus becomes particularly crucial. Rather than abandoning these archetypal energies as outdated, we must learn to engage with them in ways that honor both their eternal significance and their need for contemporary expression. The anima may speak through a man's capacity for emotional intelligence and relational awareness. The animus may manifest through a woman's entrepreneurial spirit or her capacity for intellectual leadership. The path of anima and animus integration is ultimately a path of love, not the possessive love that seeks to own the other, nor the romantic love that projects perfection onto the beloved, but the transformational love that recognizes the sacred in the depths of psychological complexity. It is the love that can hold space for another's full humanity, while continuing to grow in one's own capacity for wholeness and authenticity. As we learn to honor the contrasexual archetype within ourselves, we become capable of truly honoring the otherness of those we encounter in relationship. The anima teaches the man that the feminine is not his to possess or control, but a mystery to be approached with reverence and humility. The animus teaches the woman that the masculine is not her enemy to be conquered or her savior to be worshipped, but a principle of consciousness to be integrated and expressed in service of her deepest values. This is the sacred marriage, not the merging of two incomplete halves, but the conscious union of two whole beings who have learned to dance with the archetypal energies within themselves. It is the relationship that can serve the process of individuation rather than impeding it, the love that frees rather than binds, the connection that honors both intimacy and independence, both merger and separateness, both the known and the unknown dimensions of human experience. In the end, the anima and animus are teachers of paradox, guides into the realm where opposites reveal their secret unity. Through conscious relationship with these inner figures, we learn that strength and receptivity are not enemies but dance partners, that thinking and feeling are not opposing functions, but complementary ways of engaging with reality, that masculine and feminine are not fixed categories but flowing principles that find endless forms of creative expression. The contrasexual archetype calls us beyond the narrow confines of ego identification into the vast realm of possibility that exists when consciousness learns to embrace its own complexity. It is an invitation to wholeness that includes all the rejected, projected, and unlived aspects of our potential, a summons to the sacred marriage that births the authentic self from the union of all that we have been and all that we might yet become. Beneath the familiar landscape of personal memory, beyond the known territories of individual experience, there lies an ocean so vast that consciousness can barely comprehend its depths. This is the collective unconscious, the primordial ground from which all human awareness has emerged, the archetypal realm where the eternal patterns of existence dwell in their timeless forms. Here, in these fathomless waters, swim the great fish of meaning that have guided human consciousness since the first spark of awareness illuminated the darkness of pure instinct. To encounter the collective unconscious is to stand at the edge of everything you have ever believed about the boundaries of self and other, individual and universal, personal and transpersonal. The ego, secure in its sense of separate identity, discovers itself to be but a small island rising from depths that connect it to every other island of consciousness that has ever emerged from these same mysterious waters. The rational mind, proud of its capacity for linear thought and logical analysis, finds itself confronted with patterns of meaning that transcend all cultural boundaries and historical epochs. This is not the unconscious of personal biography, filled with forgotten memories and repressed experiences unique to one's individual journey through life. This is something far more ancient and universal, the repository of humanity's collective wisdom and collective shadow, the storehouse of images and patterns that have shaped consciousness since human beings first gazed up at the stars and wondered about their place in the cosmos. The collective unconscious makes itself known not through memories but through archetypes, those primordial images that appear spontaneously in dreams, myths, fairy tales, and religious visions across all cultures and throughout all historical periods. These are not learned patterns but inherited ones, not cultural constructs but species-wide endowments that emerge from the very structure of the human psyche itself. Consider how the Great Mother appears in countless forms throughout human culture, as Isis and Demeter, as Kali and Mary, as the Earth Goddess, and the cosmic womb from which all life emerges. Her image arises not because cultures have borrowed from each other, but because the archetypal pattern of the Great Mother lives in the depths of every human psyche, constellating naturally whenever consciousness encounters the numinous reality of the life-giving, life-sustaining, and sometimes life-devouring feminine principle. The ego, encountering such archetypal energies, may initially attempt to dismiss them as mere superstition or psychological projection. Yet the numinous quality of these encounters, their capacity to evoke awe, terror, fascination, and transformation, suggests that something far more significant is occurring. The archetypal images that emerge from the collective unconscious carry a charge of meaning that no purely personal content can match. They speak to the deepest questions of human existence. Who am I? Where do I come from? What is the meaning of life and death, love and loss, suffering and redemption? When the collective unconscious begins to stir in individual consciousness, the experience can be both overwhelming and profoundly meaningful. Dreams take on a mythic quality, filled with figures that seem to step out of ancient stories, wise old men and women who offer cryptic guidance, heroes embarking on impossible quests, trickster figures who overturn established order through sacred chaos, divine children who represent new birth and infinite possibility. The wise old man archetype may appear as the sage who dwells at the crossroads, offering counsel to those who have lost their way. He carries the accumulated wisdom of ages, the distilled essence of all seeking and finding, all questioning and understanding. Yet he offers his wisdom not as dogma but as riddles that require the seeker to discover their own truth. In dreams and active imagination, he may appear as the ancient king who has seen empires rise and fall, as the hermit who has found treasure in solitude, as the teacher whose greatest lesson is learning how to ask the right questions. The Great Mother appears not only as the nurturing feminine, but in all her archetypal complexity, as the virgin who represents pure potential, as the mother who gives birth to consciousness, as the crone who guides the dying into the mysteries beyond life. She is the earth that sustains and the tomb that receives, the womb that creates and the wisdom that comes through surrender to forces greater than the ego's will to control. But perhaps no archetype is more relevant to our times than the trickster, that shape-shifting figure who appears in every culture as the disruptor of established order, the sacred fool who reveals truth through paradox and humor. The trickster archetype constellates whenever consciousness becomes too rigid, too certain of its categories and definitions. He appears as the unexpected event that shatters careful plans, as the joke that reveals hidden truths, as the chaos that fertilizes new growth. In contemporary life, the trickster may manifest through technological disruptions that transform society overnight, through synchronicities that reveal hidden connections between seemingly unrelated events, through creative breakthroughs that emerge from playing with impossible combinations of ideas. The ego experiences the trickster's influence as disruption and confusion, but the soul recognizes him as the sacred agent of transformation who prevents consciousness from calcifying into lifeless patterns. The hero archetype represents consciousness itself in its eternal struggle to differentiate from the unconscious matrix, to bring light into darkness, order into chaos, meaning into confusion. Yet the hero's journey is not a single triumph, but an endless cycle of departure, initiation, and return. Each time consciousness achieves a new level of understanding, the hero must venture forth again into unknown territories, face new dragons, descend into new underworlds, and return with new treasures for the community of the psyche. The contemporary manifestation of the hero archetype may not involve slaying literal monsters, but the psychological pattern remains the same. The hero represents the part of the psyche that is willing to venture beyond the safe boundaries of conventional thinking, to question established assumptions, to risk everything in service of discovering what is true and meaningful. In our time, this might manifest as the entrepreneur who risks security to pursue a vision, the artist who sacrifices comfort for authentic expression, the activist who challenges unjust systems despite personal cost. But the collective unconscious contains not only helpful figures, but shadow archetypes that represent the darker potentials of human nature. The destroyer appears whenever the ego becomes identified with power for its own sake, whenever consciousness loses touch with its ethical foundation and begins to serve only its own expansion. The tyrant archetype constellates when legitimate authority becomes corrupted by the intoxication of control over others. These shadow archetypes are not evil in themselves, but represent energies that become destructive when unconscious or misdirected. The destroyer, consciously related to, becomes the necessary force that clears away what is outdated and life-denying to make space for new growth. The shadow of the king becomes the tyrant, but the integrated king archetype represents the capacity for just leadership that serves the welfare of the whole. The stirring of the collective unconscious often coincides with periods of cultural transition and transformation, when the established patterns of meaning that have sustained a civilization begin to break down. The archetypal energies that lie beneath cultural forms begin to emerge in raw, undifferentiated ways. This can manifest as religious revivals, political upheavals, artistic renaissance, or social revolution, all expressions of archetypal energies seeking new forms of incarnation in historical time. In our current era, we are witnessing the emergence of archetypal patterns that have been dormant for centuries. The Great Mother archetype stirs as human consciousness awakens to the ecological crisis and recognizes the need to restore right relationship with the earth. The wise old man appears in new forms as ancient wisdom traditions encounter modern scientific understanding. The trickster manifests through digital technologies that are transforming the very nature of communication, relationship, and identity. Yet the emergence of archetypal energies is not automatically beneficial. When these powerful forces encounter unprepared consciousness, they can produce inflation, possession, and fanaticism. The person who becomes identified with the hero archetype may develop a savior complex, believing themselves called to rescue others who have not asked for rescue. The one who becomes possessed by the Great Mother may lose all capacity for discrimination, embracing everything indiscriminately in the name of unconditional love. The key to conscious relationship with archetypal energies lies in what Jung called the symbolic attitude, the capacity to experience archetypal content as symbolic rather than literal, as meaningful pattern rather than concrete reality. The wise old man who appears in dreams is not literally an ancient sage, but a personification of the wisdom function within the psyche. The Great Mother who emerges in active imagination is not literally a goddess, but the symbolic representation of the life-giving and life-sustaining principle that operates both within the psyche and in the larger cosmos. This symbolic understanding allows consciousness to benefit from archetypal guidance without becoming possessed by archetypal inflation. The hero energy can inspire heroic action without leading to grandiose identification. The mother archetype can evoke nurturing capacity without producing unconscious enmeshment. The wise old man can provide guidance without becoming a substitute for one's own hard-won wisdom. The collective unconscious also manifests through what Jung called the cultural unconscious, those archetypal patterns that are specific to particular cultural and historical contexts, while still drawing from universal human themes. The American dream represents a cultural constellation of the hero archetype, combined with particular historical circumstances and geographical opportunities. The European focus on tradition and continuity reflects a different cultural relationship to archetypal patterns of ancestor wisdom and collective memory. Understanding these cultural layers of the collective unconscious becomes particularly important in our interconnected world, where different archetypal traditions encounter each other in unprecedented ways. The wisdom lies not in attempting to blend all traditions into a homogeneous mixture, but in learning to recognize the archetypal patterns that underlie different cultural expressions while respecting the specific forms through which these patterns have been incarnated in particular historical contexts. The stirring of the collective unconscious often manifests first through increased dream activity, as the psyche's natural symbolic function becomes more active in response to archetypal energies that are seeking expression. Dreams take on a quality of heightened significance, filled with mythic imagery and numinous encounters that leave the dreamer with a sense of having touched something sacred and transformative. Synchronistic experiences also multiply when the collective unconscious becomes activated. The meaningful coincidences that characterize synchronicity often involve archetypal symbols and themes appearing simultaneously in inner psychological experience and outer events. The person struggling with questions of authority may encounter references to kingship in books, conversations, and chance encounters within the same time period. The one wrestling with mother issues may find the great mother archetype manifesting through unexpected encounters with maternal figures, references to goddesses, or confrontations with nurturing and devouring feminine energies. These synchronistic experiences serve as bridges between the inner world of archetypal energy and the outer world of historical circumstances. They suggest that the collective unconscious is not merely an internal psychological phenomenon, but a field of meaning that connects psyche and matter, individual consciousness and cosmic process, personal transformation and collective evolution. The activation of the collective unconscious also tends to stimulate creative expression as artists, writers, musicians, and visionaries become channels for archetypal energies seeking manifestation in cultural forms. The great works of art that speak across cultural and temporal boundaries do so because they successfully incarnate archetypal patterns in forms that allow others to recognize and be transformed by these universal themes. Yet creativity emerging from the collective unconscious must be balanced with conscious craftsmanship and ethical responsibility. The artist who becomes a pure channel for archetypal energies without developing the technical skills and conscious discrimination necessary to give these energies appropriate form may produce work that is powerful but chaotic, inspiring but ultimately destructive. The visionary who receives archetypal insights without developing the wisdom to communicate them appropriately may become a source of confusion rather than illumination. The encounter with the collective unconscious invariably raises questions about the relationship between individual identity and transpersonal reality. The ego discovers that its sense of separate selfhood is both real and illusory, real as a functional necessity for navigating physical reality, but illusory insofar as it imagines itself to be independent of the larger patterns of meaning and energy that flow through all consciousness. This recognition can produce what Jung called participation mystique, a state of consciousness in which the boundaries between self and other, individual and collective, become permeable and fluid. In its positive manifestation, this can lead to experiences of cosmic consciousness, mystical union, and profound empathy with all forms of life. In its shadow manifestation, it can produce loss of individual discrimination, susceptibility to mass movements and collective possession, and the dissolution of ethical responsibility. The path of individuation requires learning to dance consciously with these archetypal energies, neither rejecting them in favor of purely ego-centered consciousness, nor being overwhelmed by them in a way that dissolves individual capacity for choice and responsibility. The individuated person becomes a bridge between the eternal and the temporal, the archetypal and the personal, the collective wisdom of the species, and the unique contributions of individual consciousness. This bridging function is particularly crucial in times of cultural transition, when established forms of meaning are breaking down and new ones have not yet crystallized. The person who has developed conscious relationship with archetypal energies can serve as a cultural creative, helping to birth new forms of meaning that honor both eternal wisdom and contemporary needs. The stirring of the collective unconscious ultimately serves the process of consciousness evolution, both individual and collective. As more individuals learn to relate consciously to archetypal energies, the collective consciousness of humanity itself begins to evolve. Old patterns of meaning that no longer serve life begin to transform. New possibilities for human relationship, creativity, and spiritual development begin to emerge. Yet this evolutionary process is not automatic or guaranteed. The archetypal energies that emerge from the collective unconscious are morally neutral. They can serve either the forces of consciousness and integration or the forces of unconsciousness and destruction. The shadow archetypes can possess entire cultures, leading to genocide, environmental destruction, and the worship of power for its own sake. The positive archetypes can be perverted into their opposites when encountered by unprepared or unethical consciousness. The responsibility lies with each individual to develop the capacity for conscious relationship with these transpersonal energies. This requires what Jung called the moral attitude, the willingness to take responsibility for one's relationship to archetypal content rather than simply being carried along by its power. It requires the development of discrimination between authentic archetypal guidance and ego inflation, disguised as spiritual insight. Most importantly, it requires the recognition that the collective unconscious is not a museum of ancient patterns, but a living, evolving reality that continues to generate new possibilities for consciousness. The archetypes themselves evolve as human consciousness evolves, taking on new forms and meanings while retaining their essential patterns. The Great Mother of our time may incorporate ecological awareness in ways that were not necessary for earlier generations. The hero archetype may need to develop capacities for collaboration and systemic thinking that were less relevant in simpler times. As we learn to relate consciously to the stirring of the collective unconscious, we become participants in the ongoing creation of meaning rather than merely inheritors of meaning created by others. We become co-creators with the archetypal energies themselves, helping to birth new forms of consciousness that can address the challenges and opportunities of our particular historical moment while remaining connected to the eternal wisdom that has guided human development throughout the ages. The collective unconscious stirs not to drag us back into primitive unconsciousness, but to call us forward into a more complete form of consciousness, one that includes both individual achievement and collective wisdom, both personal responsibility and transpersonal connection, both temporal effectiveness and eternal meaning. In learning to dance consciously with these ancient energies, we participate in the great work of consciousness evolution that has been underway since human awareness first awakened to its own existence and began the endless journey toward ever greater wholeness and understanding. In the depths of psychological transformation, when the soul has begun to stir from its long slumber and consciousness starts to align with deeper currents of meaning, the very fabric of reality seems to shift. The hard boundaries between inner and outer, psyche and matter, begin to reveal themselves as more porous than the rational mind had ever dared imagine. This is when synchronicity emerges, those meaningful coincidences that Jung recognized as glimpses into a hidden order beneath the apparent chaos of existence, moments when the universe itself seems to participate in the unfolding drama of individual consciousness. Synchronicity is not mere coincidence, not the random collision of unrelated events that the statistical mind dismisses as inevitable, given enough opportunities for chance encounters. It is something far more mysterious and significant, and a causal connection between inner psychological state and outer circumstances that suggests a profound interconnectedness between psyche and cosmos, between the movements of soul and the dance of matter through time and space. Consider the moment when you have been wrestling with a profound question, turning it over in the depths of contemplation like a prayer wheel spinning in the darkness of uncertainty. You have exhausted the resources of logical analysis, consulted the authorities, examined the problem from every conceivable angle, yet the answer continues to elude the grasping fingers of conscious understanding. Then, in a moment of surrender or distraction, you open a book at random and find the exact words you needed to hear, or overhear a conversation between strangers that speaks directly to your situation, or encounter a sequence of events so perfectly aligned with your inner process that the rational mind can only stand in amazement at the precision of the choreography. This is synchronicity, the meaningful arrangement of apparently unrelated events that creates a bridge between the inner world of psychological process and the outer world of manifest reality. It appears most frequently during periods of intense psychological transformation, when the boundaries between conscious and unconscious are becoming more permeable, when the ego's rigid control over experience is relaxing enough to allow deeper currents of meaning to flow through the cracks in ordinary causation. The ego, trained by centuries of mechanistic thinking to see the world as a collection of discrete objects bumping into each other according to predictable laws of cause and effect, struggles to comprehend synchronistic experiences. It may dismiss them as imagination, explain them away as selective attention, or file them under the category of amusing coincidences that have no bearing on serious understanding of reality. Yet the soul recognizes in these moments something sacred and significant, glimpses of a reality where meaning is not imposed by human consciousness, but discovered as an inherent property of existence itself. Jung spent decades studying these phenomena, collecting thousands of examples from his own life and the lives of his patients, gradually developing a theoretical framework that could account for experiences that seemed to violate the fundamental assumptions of scientific materialism. He came to understand synchronicity as evidence of what he called the unus mundus, the underlying unity that connects all phenomena, the hidden wholeness that expresses itself through the apparent multiplicity of separate events and entities. The appearance of synchronicity in one's life often signals that the process of individuation has reached a critical threshold. The ego has loosened its grip on the illusion of complete autonomy and begun to recognize its participation in larger patterns of meaning and purpose. The psyche has opened to archetypal influences that connect individual consciousness to transpersonal sources of guidance and wisdom. In this state of openness, the barrier between inner and outer begins to dissolve, allowing for those moments of meaningful coincidence that reveal the secret connections underlying apparent chaos. Synchronistic experiences often cluster around major life transitions: births, deaths, marriages, divorces, career changes, spiritual awakenings, creative breakthroughs. These are precisely the moments when consciousness is most open to transformation, when the established patterns of meaning are being challenged or reorganized, when the psyche is actively seeking new forms of understanding and connection. It is as if the universe itself conspires to support the process of psychological growth by providing external confirmations of internal movements, outer signs that validate inner knowing. The person experiencing synchronicity may find that dreams and waking life begin to echo each other in uncanny ways. The symbol that appeared in last night's dream manifests as a billboard encountered during the morning commute. The animal that served as a guide in active imagination appears unexpectedly in physical reality at a moment of decision or uncertainty. The number that has been recurring in meditation suddenly appears everywhere, on license plates, receipts, addresses, phone numbers, as if reality itself were speaking in a symbolic language that consciousness is finally beginning to understand. These experiences can be profoundly transformative, offering a sense of being held and guided by forces larger than the individual ego. They suggest that the path of individuation is not a solitary journey, but a participation in a cosmic process that supports and nurtures the development of consciousness. The person touched by synchronicity often reports a profound shift in worldview, moving from a sense of isolation and meaninglessness toward recognition of their participation in a meaningful and interconnected universe. Yet synchronicity is not a supernatural phenomenon that violates natural law, but rather a glimpse into dimensions of natural law that mechanistic science has not yet learned to perceive or measure. Jung collaborated with the physicist Wolfgang Pauli to explore the possibility that synchronicity represents the psychological aspect of a causal connections that quantum physics was beginning to discover at the level of subatomic particles. They speculated that consciousness and matter might be complementary aspects of a deeper reality that transcends the dualistic thinking that separates mind from world, subject from object, observer from observed. This quantum understanding of synchronicity suggests that consciousness is not merely a passive observer of an objective reality, but an active participant in the ongoing creation of the world we experience. The inner state of consciousness somehow influences the probability patterns that govern which of many possible events will actually manifest in physical reality. This is not wishful thinking or magical ideation, but a recognition that the hard boundary between consciousness and matter may be more permeable than classical physics assumed. The appearance of synchronicity often follows what Jung called a lowering of the mental level, moments when the usual dominance of rational consciousness is relaxed, allowing unconscious contents to approach the threshold of awareness. This may occur during meditation, creative work, illness, emotional crisis, or simple daydreaming. In these states of receptivity, consciousness becomes more sensitive to the subtle patterns that connect inner psychological process with outer circumstance. Dreams play a particularly important role in synchronistic experiences, often providing symbolic previews of external events that will later manifest in waking life. The person may dream of a particular animal or symbol, and then encounter that same image repeatedly in the following days, as if the dream were introducing a new archetypal theme that is beginning to constellation in both psychic and physical reality. These dream reality correspondences suggest that the unconscious has access to information about future possibilities that rational consciousness cannot perceive through ordinary sensory channels. Active imagination also serves as a fertile ground for synchronistic experiences. The images and figures that emerge during conscious fantasy work may later appear as actual people, places, or situations encountered in outer life. The inner journey mapped out through imaginative dialogue with unconscious contents may find itself reflected in the actual circumstances and opportunities that present themselves in the external world. This suggests that the boundary between imagination and reality is more fluid than the literal mind assumes, and that conscious engagement with unconscious contents can actually influence the probability patterns that govern external manifestation. The I Ching, the ancient Chinese book of changes, provided Jung with a practical method for exploring synchronistic principles. By casting coins or counting yarrow stalks to generate hexagrams that are then interpreted as symbolic guidance for specific life situations, the I Ching operates on the assumption that the inner state of the questioner is meaningfully connected to the outer patterns revealed by the random fall of coins or stalks. Jung found that this system often produced remarkably relevant guidance, as if the synchronistic principle were built into the very structure of the oracle itself. Astrology represents another traditional system based on synchronistic principles, the assumption that the positions of celestial bodies at the moment of birth are meaningfully connected to psychological and biographical patterns that will unfold throughout the individual's lifetime. Rather than seeing planetary influences as causal forces that determine human behavior, Jung understood astrological correlations as synchronistic connections between cosmic timing and individual psychology, both expressions of the same underlying archetypal patterns. Yet synchronicity is not limited to traditional divinatory systems, but can emerge through any medium when consciousness is open to symbolic communication. The person attuned to synchronistic patterns may find guidance through random encounters with books, overheard conversations, unexpected meetings, mechanical breakdowns that force a change of plans, or any other external circumstance that meaningfully reflects their inner psychological state. The challenge in working with synchronicity lies in developing the capacity for symbolic thinking that can recognize meaningful patterns without falling into superstitious literalism. Not every coincidence is synchronistic, and not every synchronistic event carries the same level of significance. The ability to discriminate between meaningful coincidence and random occurrence develops gradually through experience and reflection, requiring what Jung called the symbolic attitude, the capacity to experience events as both literal facts and symbolic communications. Synchronicity often manifests most powerfully around questions of meaning and purpose, rather than practical concerns about material success or external achievement. The person wondering whether to leave an unfulfilling job may encounter a series of synchronistic events that clarify the deeper questions underlying the career decision. The one struggling with relationship issues may find that synchronistic experiences illuminate the archetypal patterns that are being constellated through their interpersonal dynamics. The appearance of synchronicity can also serve as confirmation that one is on the right path, aligned with deeper currents of purpose and meaning. The decisions that truly serve individuation often generate synchronistic support, doors opening, resources appearing, helpful people emerging at crucial moments. Conversely, choices that violate one's authentic nature may be met with a conspicuous absence of synchronistic flow as if the universe itself were withholding its support for directions that lead away from psychological truth. Yet synchronicity is not a cosmic reward system that provides external validation for good behavior or right thinking. It emerges most naturally when consciousness has achieved a particular quality of receptive attention, alert but not controlling, open but not passive, engaged but not attached to specific outcomes. This is the attitude of active receptivity that allows one to participate consciously in the flow of meaningful coincidence without trying to manipulate or control it. The person who attempts to force synchronistic experiences through magical thinking or wishful hoping usually finds that such efforts block rather than facilitate meaningful coincidence. Synchronicity emerges from the deep unconscious processes of individuation, not from ego desire or conscious intention. It cannot be summoned on demand, but only welcomed when it appears, recognized when it manifests, integrated when it offers its gifts of meaning and guidance. In our hyper-connected digital age, synchronicity may manifest through technological media, meaningful emails arriving at precisely the right moment, social media posts that speak directly to one's current situation, random encounters through dating apps, or professional networking that feel destined rather than coincidental. The medium matters less than the quality of meaningful connection between inner psychological state and outer circumstance. The multiplication of synchronistic experiences often accompanies what Jung called the transcendent function, the psychological mechanism that creates bridges between conscious and unconscious contents, allowing for the emergence of new possibilities that transcend the limitations of both rational understanding and unconscious compulsion. Synchronicity serves as external confirmation that this internal process of creative synthesis is occurring, providing outer signs that validate inner movements toward greater wholeness and integration. Groups and communities can also experience collective synchronicities when they are aligned around shared purposes that serve the process of consciousness evolution. The right people may appear at the right moments, resources may manifest when needed, obstacles may dissolve in ways that suggest the support of forces larger than individual planning and effort. These collective synchronicities suggest that the principle of meaningful coincidence operates not only in individual psychology, but in the dynamics of group consciousness and social transformation. Yet the interpretation of synchronistic events requires great care and wisdom. The ego may be tempted to see synchronicity as confirmation of its own agenda rather than guidance toward deeper truth. The person experiencing frequent meaningful coincidences may develop an inflated sense of special destiny or cosmic importance. The challenge is to remain humble before the mystery of synchronicity while allowing its gifts to support the genuine process of psychological development. Synchronicity ultimately points toward a worldview that recognizes consciousness and cosmos as participants in a single creative process, rather than seeing human awareness as an accident in a meaningless universe. Synchronistic experiences suggest that consciousness and reality are intimately interconnected aspects of an evolving whole that seeks greater complexity, beauty, and meaning through the countless individual journeys of awakening and integration. The person who has learned to recognize and work with synchronistic patterns develops a different relationship to planning and control. Instead of trying to force predetermined outcomes through willpower and strategy alone, they learn to dance with the emerging possibilities that synchronicity reveals, allowing conscious intention to collaborate with unconscious wisdom and cosmic timing. This is not passive fatalism, but active participation in the creative unfolding of potential that serves both individual fulfillment and collective evolution. In the end, synchronicity serves as a bridge between the scientific worldview that sees reality in terms of mechanical causation and the spiritual worldview that recognizes the presence of meaning and purpose in the very structure of existence. It suggests that the universe is neither purely random nor rigidly determined, but something more interesting and mysterious, a creative process in which consciousness and cosmos collaborate in the ongoing generation of novelty, beauty, and significance. To live in awareness of synchronicity is to inhabit a world that is alive with meaning, responsive to consciousness, and supportive of the process of psychological and spiritual development. It is to recognize that we are not isolated individuals struggling alone against an indifferent universe, but participants in a cosmic drama of awakening where every genuine step toward greater consciousness is met with the support and guidance of the mystery that dreams us all into existence. In the deepest chambers of the psyche, where light and shadow meet like lovers in an ancient dance, something miraculous begins to stir. It is neither the voice of your conscious mind with its careful plans and reasonable fears, nor the wild whisper of your unconscious depths, with their primal wisdom and forgotten truths. It is something else entirely, a third presence that emerges from the sacred tension between these opposing forces like a bridge of starlight, spanning the chasm between two worlds. This is what the great explorer of the soul, Carl Jung, called the transcendent function, not a supernatural power descending from above, but a natural capacity that arises from below, from the very conflict that seems to tear us apart. For in the heart of every psychological tension lies a secret. The seeds of transformation are sown not in peace, but in the fertile soil of inner contradiction. Listen carefully to what your soul already knows. You are not meant to choose sides in the eternal battle between your light and your darkness, your persona and your authenticity, your ego's demands and your shadow's truths. You are meant to become the sacred space in which these opposites can meet, touch, and give birth to something entirely new. The ego, that faithful guardian of your conscious identity, has spent a lifetime learning the language of either or. Either you are good or bad, successful or failing, loved or abandoned, worthy or worthless. It divides the world into neat categories because division feels safe, manageable, controllable. But the soul speaks a different tongue, the ancient language of both and, where contradictions dance together like particles of light that are simultaneously wave and particle, depending on how they are observed. In the depths of your being, a laboratory of the spirit has been quietly working, conducting experiments in consciousness that would astound the most brilliant alchemist. Here, in the crucible of your inner tensions, lead is being transmuted into gold, not through the manipulation of metals, but through the patient transformation of your relationship to contradiction itself. The process begins with recognition. You start to notice that every time you try to eliminate one side of a psychological polarity, it returns with greater force. Push away your anger, and it erupts in unexpected moments. Deny your sadness, and it seeps into every joy. Reject your neediness, and it puppeteers your relationships from the shadows. Suppress your darkness, and it poisons your light from within. The transcendent function whispers its first teaching. What you resist persists, and what you embrace transforms. Not through the ego's strategy of conquest or the shadow's impulse for revenge, but through a third way that honors both while being enslaved by neither. This is the moment when you begin to understand that psychological wholeness is not about achieving perfect balance, like some impossible yoga pose of the mind, but about developing the capacity to hold imbalance with grace, to dance with contradiction rather than being torn apart by it. The transcendent function is your inner choreographer, teaching you the steps of this eternal dance. Watch how it works in the theater of your daily life. You find yourself caught between the desire for security and the longing for adventure. The old ego would demand that you choose. Be responsible or be free, play it safe or take risks, settle down or explore. But the transcendent function offers a different possibility. It asks, how might your need for security serve your capacity for adventure? How might your hunger for exploration deepen your appreciation for home? Suddenly, you discover that security and adventure are not enemies but dance partners, each one incomplete without the other. True security comes not from avoiding all risks, but from developing the inner resources to navigate uncertainty with confidence. Real adventure is not the escape from all stability, but the courage to explore new territories while remaining rooted in your deepest values. This is the alchemical wedding that Jung spoke of with such reverence, not the union of king and queen in some external fairy tale, but the sacred marriage of opposites within your own psyche. Thesis and antithesis embrace and give birth to synthesis, but this is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of an ever-expanding spiral of development where each new synthesis becomes the thesis for the next level of integration. The transcendent function emerges most powerfully in moments of crisis, when the ego's usual strategies have failed and the old ways of being no longer serve. You stand at a crossroads where every path seems to lead away from something essential, and choosing any single direction feels like a betrayal of some vital part of yourself. This is not a problem to be solved, but a sacred moment to be entered. In these threshold moments, the transcendent function appears like a wise counselor who has been waiting patiently in the wings of your consciousness. It does not resolve the tension by eliminating one side or the other, but by revealing a third option that was invisible to the either-or mind of the ego. This third way is not a compromise, that weak, bloodless solution that satisfies no one, but a creative synthesis that transcends the limitations of both original positions. Consider the woman torn between her role as devoted mother and her calling as creative artist. The ego sees only conflict. Choose the children or choose the art. Be a good mother or a selfish artist. But the transcendent function whispers a deeper truth. What if motherhood and artistry are not competitors, but collaborators in the great work of creating life? What if the nurturing required by children teaches lessons in patience and presence that serve the creative process? What if the creative fire illuminates new ways of mothering that are more authentic and alive? The transcendent function does not answer these questions with concepts but with lived experience. It orchestrates encounters, synchronicities, and inner movements that reveal possibilities the rational mind could never have conceived. Opportunities arise that honor both the mother and the artist. Solutions emerge that serve the children and the creative soul. A third way opens that was literally unthinkable before the transcendent function began its mysterious work. This is not magic thinking or wishful fantasy. It is the recognition of a fundamental truth. Consciousness itself is creative, and when we align with its deepest currents, we participate in the ongoing creation of reality. The transcendent function is consciousness evolving, using the raw material of our personal contradictions to weave new patterns of possibility into existence. But this process requires something radical from the ego, the willingness to not know, to remain suspended in uncertainty long enough for the third option to emerge. The ego's greatest fear is not having an answer, not being in control, not knowing what comes next. It would rather choose poorly than not choose at all. But the transcendent function asks for something the ego finds almost unbearable: faith in the process itself, trust that solutions exist beyond the range of current vision. This is why Jung emphasized that the transcendent function cannot be willed into existence through effort or discipline. It emerges from a different quality of consciousness, one that is simultaneously active and receptive, engaged and surrendered, alert and patient. It is the consciousness of the gardener who plants seeds and tends the soil but cannot force the flowers to bloom. The cultivation of this consciousness begins with learning to live comfortably in the tension between opposites, without rushing to resolve it prematurely. When you feel the pull in two different directions, instead of immediately choosing sides, you pause, you breathe, you create internal space for both voices to be heard fully, without judgment or agenda. You discover that most of your inner conflicts are not really about choosing between good and evil, right and wrong, but between different goods, different truths, different aspects of your wholeness that are each claiming their rightful place in your life. The transcendent function helps you become large enough to hold them all, spacious enough to be the container for your own complexity. This expansion of consciousness is not always comfortable. The ego must stretch to accommodate contradictions that once seemed mutually exclusive. Old certainties dissolve. Familiar categories blur. The neat boundaries of identity become more fluid, more permeable. You begin to discover that you are both stronger and more vulnerable than you thought, both wiser and more innocent, both more ordinary and more extraordinary than your ego's stories ever suggested. The transcendent function reveals that your psychological opposites are not really opposite at all, but different faces of the same underlying reality. Your strength and your weakness both arise from your sensitivity. Your independence and your interdependence both reflect your fundamental aliveness. Your light and your shadow both serve your capacity for wholeness. As this recognition deepens, something profound begins to shift in your relationship to yourself and others. The judgmental voice that once divided everything into acceptable and unacceptable begins to soften. Compassion arises not as a moral choice, but as a natural response to recognizing the complexity that lives within everyone. You begin to see that what you once rejected in others was often what you had not yet learned to embrace in yourself. The transcendent function is ultimately an expression of love, not the sentimental love that seeks only harmony and agreement, but the fierce love that is willing to embrace the whole of reality, including its contradictions and chaos. It is the love that sees the hidden wholeness within apparent fragmentation, the secret order within seeming disorder, the emerging synthesis within persistent thesis and antithesis. This love does not eliminate conflict, but transforms its meaning. Conflicts become creative tensions. Problems become invitations to greater consciousness. Symptoms become messengers from neglected parts of the psyche. The transcendent function teaches you to receive everything that arises in your inner world as potentially useful information about your next steps toward wholeness. The emergence of the transcendent function marks a fundamental shift in how you relate to your own psychology. Instead of trying to manage or control your inner world, you begin to collaborate with it. Instead of seeing your unconscious as an enemy to be conquered or a child to be managed, you recognize it as a creative partner in the great work of becoming who you truly are. This collaboration requires a new kind of conversation with yourself, not the monologue of ego consciousness talking to itself, but a genuine dialogue between different aspects of your being. You learn to ask questions and wait for answers that come not from your rational mind, but from deeper sources of knowing. You develop the capacity to listen to your dreams, your symptoms, your slips of tongue, your seemingly irrational impulses as communications from parts of yourself that are seeking integration. The transcendent function emerges most powerfully when you learn to hold these conversations with curiosity rather than judgment, with openness rather than agenda. You begin to treat your inner world like a foreign country that you are visiting with respect, eager to learn its customs and understand its language, rather than like a territory to be colonized by your conscious intentions. As this dialogue deepens, you discover that your psyche is far more intelligent, creative, and resourceful than your ego ever imagined. Solutions to long-standing problems begin to emerge from sources you cannot identify or control. Creative insights arise that seem to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Relationships shift in response to internal changes you have made but never directly communicated. The transcendent function reveals that the boundary between inner and outer transformation is far more porous than the ego believes. As you learn to bridge the opposites within yourself, you develop a natural capacity to serve as a bridge for others, not by giving advice or attempting to fix their conflicts, but by embodying the possibility of holding contradictions with grace. This is not about becoming perfect or achieving some impossible state of perpetual balance. The transcendent function operates through you, not as you. It is a capacity that emerges when you learn to get out of your own way, to create space for possibilities that are larger than your current understanding or control. The ultimate gift of the transcendent function is the recognition that you are not the author of your own transformation. You are its devoted collaborator. Something larger than your personal will is orchestrating the complex dance of development, using your willingness and attention as instruments in a symphony whose full score you may never see, but whose beauty you can learn to trust and serve. In this service, you discover a freedom that the ego's strategies of control and domination could never provide. The freedom that comes from aligning with the deepest currents of your own becoming, from participating consciously in the mystery of your own unfolding, from trusting that every contradiction you face is a doorway to greater wholeness, waiting to be opened by the transcendent function that lives at the heart of your soul's eternal dance. In the secret architecture of the soul, there exists a law as ancient as the turning of the seasons, as inevitable as the swing of a pendulum in the depths of time. The Greeks called it Anantiodroia, the running toward the opposite, and Jung recognized it as one of the most profound principles governing the mysterious terrain of psychological development. It is the soul's way of maintaining its essential balance, even when the ego believes it has finally achieved the perfect life, the flawless persona, the complete mastery over its darker impulses. Listen to what your deepest self already knows. Every psychological extreme carries within it the seeds of its own reversal. The saint discovers cruelty, the cynic finds faith, the controller learns surrender, the victim awakens to their power. This is not failure or weakness, or some cosmic joke played upon the earnest seeker. This is the psyche's profound wisdom, its way of preventing any single aspect of your nature from becoming so dominant that it strangles the life out of your wholeness. Anantiodroia appears in your life, like an unexpected guest arriving at the moment when you least want visitors, when you have everything arranged just the way you like it. You have spent years, perhaps decades, cultivating a particular way of being. Perhaps you have become the helper, the strong one, the one who never needs anything from anyone. Your identity is built around this role, like a magnificent cathedral, every stone carefully placed, every arch perfectly proportioned. And then, in the middle of your certainty, something shifts. A crack appears in the foundation of your carefully constructed self. The helper discovers an overwhelming need to be cared for. The strong one crumbles into unexpected fragility. The independent soul finds itself desperate for connection. The ego experiences this as catastrophe, as the collapse of everything it has worked so hard to build and maintain. But the soul recognizes Anantiodroia as a homecoming, the return of the lost and rejected parts of yourself that have been waiting patiently in the shadows of your consciousness, gathering strength for their inevitable emergence. Every quality you have developed to excess has been secretly preparing its opposite, like a seed of chaos planted in the heart of your perfect order, waiting for the right conditions to sprout. Consider the perfectionist who has spent a lifetime crafting an image of flawless competence, whose every achievement has been polished to a brilliant shine. They have banished messiness from their world, eliminated uncertainty from their plans, created systems and structures that protect them from the humiliation of making mistakes. Their persona gleams like armor in the sun, impenetrable and impressive. Then comes the day when the carefully constructed life begins to unravel. Perhaps it starts small, a forgotten appointment, a missed deadline, a moment of visible confusion in front of colleagues. But the unraveling has its own momentum, like water finding its way through the tiniest crack in a dam. Soon, chaos is everywhere. Projects fall behind, relationships become messy, emotions refuse to behave according to schedule. The perfectionist finds themselves living in exactly the kind of disorder they have spent their whole life avoiding. The ego experiences this as a terrible failure, evidence that they were never really as competent as they pretended to be. But Anantiodroia reveals a different truth. The perfectionist's obsessive control was actually a defense against their profound fear of imperfection. The chaos that emerges is not punishment, but medicine, the psyche's way of reintroducing them to their own humanity, their own capacity to make mistakes and still be worthy of love. The great reversal teaches what no amount of success could ever convey, that wholeness includes imperfection, that true competence embraces incompetence, that real strength is found not in the elimination of weakness, but in the integration of vulnerability. The chaos is not the enemy of order, but its secret partner, the necessary counterbalance that keeps life flowing and growing, rather than crystallizing into rigid patterns. Or witness the helper, that generous soul who has built their entire identity around being useful to others, who knows themselves only through their capacity to ease suffering and solve problems. They have become so skilled at intuiting others' needs that they have forgotten how to recognize their own. Their sense of worth depends entirely on their ability to give, to serve, to sacrifice their own desires for the greater good. Anantiodroia arrives for the helper as a growing resentment that seems to come from nowhere. Suddenly, the requests for help feel like demands. The grateful smiles of those they serve seem patronizing. A strange selfishness begins to emerge, a voice that asks, "What about me? When is it my turn to receive?" The ego is horrified by this development, interpreting it as evidence of moral decay, as proof that they were never as generous as they believed themselves to be. But the soul knows better. The selfishness that emerges through Anantiodroia is not greed or narcissism. It is the healthy self-regard that the helper has been systematically suppressing in service of their persona. The resentment is not evidence of a cruel heart, but the natural response of a psyche that has been denied its rightful portion of care and attention. The great reversal is teaching the helper that true service requires a full self, that you cannot give what you do not have, that generosity flows most freely from a well-tended rather than a depleted source. The spiritual seeker experiences Anantiodroia as a sudden fascination with the material world they have spent years transcending. After countless hours of meditation, prayer, and contemplation, they find themselves drawn to money, sex, power, all the earthly concerns they believed they had risen above. The ego is mortified by this descent, this apparent fall from grace. Surely this proves that their spiritual progress was illusory, that they are not as evolved as they thought. But Anantiodroia whispers a different interpretation. The spirit needs the flesh to be complete. The transcendent requires the immanent for its full expression. The ascending path must be balanced by the descending current that brings heaven into earth. The seeker's sudden attraction to material reality is not a betrayal of their spiritual nature, but its completion, the soul's way of preventing spirituality from becoming a sophisticated form of escapism. The great reversal reveals that every extreme position, no matter how noble or admirable, creates its own shadow. The more completely you identify with one side of any polarity, the more powerfully its opposite gathers force in the unconscious, waiting for the moment when your defenses are down to burst forth with surprising intensity. This is why the most generous people can become suddenly greedy, why the most peaceful individuals can erupt in unexpected violence, why the most rational minds can be seized by irrational impulses. Anantiodroia is not random or cruel. It is the psyche's way of maintaining its fundamental health and vitality. Just as the body develops fever to fight infection, the psyche produces psychological reversals to combat the infection of one-sidedness, the disease of identifying too completely with any single aspect of your potential wholeness. The process is painful for the ego because it threatens the very foundations of identity. Everything you thought you knew about yourself, every story you have told about who you are and what you stand for, is called into question by the emergence of its opposite. The person you were so proud of being reveals themselves to be only half the story, and the other half, the half you have been running from or denying, demands its rightful place in your conscious life. This is why Anantiodroia often coincides with what we call midlife crisis, though it can occur at any age when psychological development has reached a point of extreme imbalance. The successful businessman suddenly wants to be an artist. The devoted wife discovers her fierce independence. The rational scientist becomes fascinated by mysticism. The confirmed bachelor falls deeply in love. These are not failures of character, but evolutionary pressures, the soul's way of pushing toward greater completeness. The wisdom of Anantiodroia lies not in resisting these reversals, but in learning to recognize them as natural and necessary corrections to the course of your development. Instead of fighting the emergence of your opposite, you can begin to welcome it as the return of an exiled part of yourself, like a prodigal child coming home after years of wandering in the wilderness of your unconscious. This welcoming requires a fundamental shift in how you understand psychological health. Instead of seeing consistency as a virtue and change as a threat, you begin to recognize that the capacity for contradiction, for holding multiple truths simultaneously, is a sign of psychological maturity. The rigid person who never changes is not strong but brittle, vulnerable to being shattered by the very forces they refuse to bend with.